boil down to neurochemistry. So if you get a little bit of control over that, you provide people the option to do better. And in the way I read history, the way people have dealt with having better tools is that they most often, in the end, do better, with huge asterisks. But I think it's an interesting, a worthy, and noble pursuit to give people more options, more tools.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at human history. You just imagine all these neurobiological mechanisms, Stalin, Hitler, all of these, Genghis Khan, all of them just had like a brain. It just a bunch of neurons, like a few tens of billions of neurons, gaining a bunch of information over a period of time. They have a set of module that does language and memory and all that. And from there, in the case of those people, they're able to murder millions of people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
all that coming from, there's not some glorified notion of a dictator of this enormous mind or something like this. It's just the brain.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of that has to do with how well people like that can organize those around them.
Other brains.
Yeah. And so I always find it interesting to look to primatology, look to our closest non-human relatives for clues as to how humans are going to behave and what particular humans are able to achieve. And so you look at chimpanzees and bonobos, and they're similar but different in their social structures, particularly. And I went to Emory in Atlanta and studied under Frans de Waal, the great Frans de Waal, who was kind of the leading primatologist, who recently died. And his work at looking at chimps through the lens of, how you would watch an episode of Friends and understand the motivations of the characters interacting with each other. He would look at a chimp colony and basically apply that lens. I'm massively oversimplifying it. If you do that, instead of just saying, subject 473, through his feces, it's subject 471, you talk about them in terms of their human struggles, accord them the dignity of themselves as actors with understandable goals and drives, what they want out of life. And primarily it's, the things we want out of life: food, sex, companionship, power. You can understand chimp and bonobo behavior in the same lights much more easily. And I think doing so gives you the tools you need to reduce human behavior from the kind of false complexity that we layer onto it with language, and look at it in terms of, these humans are looking for companionship, sex, food, power. And I think that's a pretty powerful tool to have in understanding human behavior.
And I just went to the Amazon jungle for a few weeks, and it's a very visceral reminder that a lot of life on Earth is just trying to get laid.
Yeah.
They're all screaming at each other. Yeah. Like, I saw a lot of monkeys, and they're just trying to impress each other. Or maybe there's a battle for power, but a lot of the battle for power has to do with them getting laid.
Right. Breeding rights often go with alpha status. And so if you can get a piece of that, then you're going to do okay.
And would like to think that we're somehow fundamentally different, but especially when it comes to primates, we really aren't. We can use fancier poetic language, but maybe some of the underlying drives that motivate us are similar.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And all of that is coming from the brain.
Yeah.
So when did you first start studying the brain as a biological mechanism?
Basically, the moment I got to college, I started looking around for labs that I could do neuroscience work in. I originally approached that from the angle of looking at interactions between the brain and the immune system, which isn't the most obvious place to start. But I had this idea at the time that the contents of your thoughts would have an impact, a direct impact, maybe a powerful one, on non-conscious systems in your body, the systems we think of as, homeostatic, automatic mechanisms like fighting off a virus, like repairing a wound. Um, and sure enough, there are big crossovers between the two. I mean, it gets to kind of a key point that I think goes under recognized. One of the things people don't recognize or appreciate about the human brain enough, and that is that it basically controls or has a huge role in almost everything that your body does. Um, like you try to name an example of something in your body that isn't directly controlled or massively influenced by the brain, and it's pretty hard. I mean, you might say like bone healing or something, but even those systems, the hypothalamus and pituitary end up playing a role in coordinating the endocrine system that does have a direct influence on, say, the calcium level in your blood that goes to bone healing. So non-obvious connections between those things implicate the brain as really a potent prime mover in all of health.
One of the things I realized in the other direction too, how most of the systems in the body are integrated with the human brain, like they affect the brain also, like the immune system. I think there's just, people who study Alzheimer's and those kinds of things. It's just surprising how much you can understand of that from the immune system, from the other systems that don't obviously seem to have anything to do with sort of the nervous system. They all play together.
Yeah, you could understand how that would be driven by evolution too, just in some simple examples. If you get sick, if you get a communicable disease, you get the flu, it's pretty advantageous for your immune system to tell your brain, hey, now be antisocial for a few days. Don't go be the life of the party tonight. In fact, maybe just cuddle up somewhere warm under a blanket and just stay there for a day or two. And sure enough, that tends to be the behavior that you see both in animals and in humans. If you get sick, elevated levels of interleukins in your blood and TNF alpha in your blood ask the brain to cut back on social activity and even moving around. You have lower locomotor activity in animals that are infected with viruses.
So from there, the early days in neuroscience to surgery, when did that step happen? Which is a leap.
It was sort of an evolution of thought. I wanted to study the brain. I started studying the brain in undergrad in this neuroimmunology lab. I, from there, realized at some point that I didn't want to just generate knowledge. I wanted to affect real changes in the actual world, in actual people's lives. And so after having not really thought about going into medical school, I was on a track to go into a PhD program. I said, well, I'd like that option. I'd like to actually potentially help tangible people in front of me. And doing a little digging, found that there exists these MD, PhD programs where you can choose not to choose between them and do both. And so I went to USC for medical school and had a joint PhD program with Caltech, where I met, actually chose that program particularly because of a researcher at Caltech named Richard Anderson, who's one of the godfathers of primate neuroscience. It has a macaque lab where Utah arrays and other electrodes were being inserted into the brains of monkeys to try to understand how intentions were being encoded in the brain. So, I ended up there with the idea that maybe I would be a neurologist and study the brain on the side, and then discovered that neurology, again, I'm going to make enemies by saying this, but
yeah.
Neurology predominantly and distressingly to me is the practice of diagnosing a thing and then saying good luck with that when there's not much we can do. And neurosurgery, very differently, it's a powerful lever on taking people that are headed in a bad direction and changing their course, in the sense of brain tumors that are potentially treatable or curable with surgery. Even aneurysms in the brain, blood vessels that are going to rupture, you can save lives, really, is at the end of the day what mattered to me. And so I was at USC, as I mentioned. That happens to be one of the great neurosurgery programs. And so I met these truly epic neurosurgeons, Alex Kalesi and Micah Puzzo and Steve Giannotta and Marty Weiss, these sort of epic people that were just human beings in front of me. And so it kind of changed my thinking from neurosurgeons are distant gods that live on another planet and occasionally come and visit us, to these are humans that have problems and are people. And there's nothing fundamentally preventing me from being one of them. And so at the last minute in medical school, I changed gears from going into a different specialty and switched into neurosurgery, which cost me a year. I had to do another year of research because I was so far along in the process that to switch into neurosurgery, the deadlines had already passed. So it was a decision that cost time, but absolutely worth it.
What was the hardest part of the training on the neurosurgeon track?
Yeah, two things. I think that residency in neurosurgery is sort of a competition of pain, of like how much pain can you eat and smile.
Yeah.
And so there's work hour restrictions that are not really, they're viewed at, I think, internally among the residents as weakness. Mm-hmm. And so most neurosurgery residents try to work as hard as they can. And that, I think, necessarily means working long hours and sometimes over the work hour limits. And, we care about being compliant with whatever regulations are in front of us. But I think more important than that, people want to give their all in becoming a better neurosurgeon because the stakes are so high. And so it's a real fight to get residents to, say, go home at the end of their shift and not stay and do more surgery.
Are you seriously saying like one of the hardest things is literally like forcing them to get sleep and rest and all this kind of stuff?
Historically, that was the case. Hilarious. I think the next generation, I think the next generation is more compliant and more self-care.
Weaker is what you mean. All right, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I didn't say it.
Now I'm making enemies. No, okay, I get it. Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah. So what was the second thing?
The personalities, and maybe the two are connected. But
so was it pretty competitive?
It's competitive, and it's also, as we touched on earlier, primates like power, and I think neurosurgery has long had this aura of mystique and excellence and whatever about it. And so it's an invitation, I think, for people that are cloaked in that authority. A board certified neurosurgeon is basically a walking fallacious appeal to authority, right? You have license to walk into any room and act like you're, an expert on whatever. And fighting that tendency is not something that most neurosurgeons do well. Humility isn't the forte.
Yeah, I have friends who know you, and whenever they speak about you, that yours have the surprising quality for a neurosurgeon of humility, which I think indicates that it's not as common as perhaps in other professions, because there is a kind of gigantic sort of heroic aspect to neurosurgery, and I think it gets to people's head a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think that that allows me to play well at an Elon company. Yes. Because Elon, one of his strengths, I think, is to just instantly see through fallacy from authority. Yeah. So nobody walks into a room that he's in and says, well, God damn it, you have to trust me. I'm the guy that built the last, 10 rockets or something. And he says, well, you did it wrong and we can do it better. Or I'm the guy that, kept Ford alive for the last 50 years. You listen to me on how to build cars. And he says, no. And so you don't walk into a room that he's in and say, well, I'm a neurosurgeon. Let me tell you how to do it. He's going to say, well, I'm a human being that has a brain. I can think from first principles myself. Thank you very much. And here's how I think it ought to be done. Let's go try it and see who's right. And that's, proven, I think, over and over in his case to be a very powerful approach.
If we just take that tangent, there's a fascinating interdisciplinary team at Neuralink that you get to interact with, including Elon. What do you think is the secret to a successful team? What have you learned from just getting to observe these folks?
Yeah.
World experts in different disciplines work together.
Yeah, there's a sweet spot where people disagree and forcefully speak their mind and passionately defend their position, and yet are still able to accept information from others and change their ideas when they're wrong. And so I like the analogy of sort of how you polish rocks. You put hard things in a hard container and spin it. People bash against each other, and out comes a more refined product. And so to make a good team at Neuralink, we've tried to find people that are not afraid to defend their ideas passionately, and occasionally strongly disagree with people that they're working with, and have the best idea come out on top. It's not an easy balance. Again, to refer back to the primate brain, it's not something that is inherently built into the primate brain to say, I passionately put all my chips on this position and now I'm just going to walk away from it and admit you were right. Mm-hmm. Part of our brains tell us that is a power loss. That is a loss of face, a loss of standing in the community. And now you're a Zeta chump because your idea got trounced. And you just have to, recognize that little voice in the back of your head is maladaptive and it's not helping the team win.
Yeah, you have to have the confidence to be able to walk away from an idea that you hold on to.
Yeah.
And if you do that often enough, you're actually going to become the best in the world at your thing. I mean, that rapid iteration.
Yeah, you'll at least be a member of a winning team.
Ride the wave. What did you learn? You mentioned there's a lot of amazing neurosurgeons at USC. What lessons about surgery and life have you learned from those folks?
Yeah, I think working your ass off, working hard while functioning as a member of a team, getting a job done that is incredibly difficult. Working incredibly long hours, being up all night, taking care of someone that you think probably won't survive no matter what you do. Working hard to make people that you passionately dislike look good the next morning. These folks were relentless in their pursuit of excellent neurosurgical technique, decade over decade, and I think were well recognized for that excellence. So it's especially Marty Weiss, Steve Giannotta, Mike Capuzzo, they made huge contributions not only to surgical technique, but they built training programs that trained dozens or hundreds of amazing neurosurgeons. I was just lucky to kind of be in their wake.
What's that like? You mentioned doing a surgery where the person is likely not to survive. Does that wear on you?
Yeah. It's especially challenging when you, with all respect to our elders, it doesn't hit so much when you're taking care of an 80-year-old and something was going to get them pretty soon anyway. And so you lose a patient like that, and it was part of the natural course of what is expected of them in the coming years, regardless. Taking care of, a father of 2 or 3, 4 young kids, so someone in their 30s that didn't have it coming, and they show up in your ER having their first seizure of their life, and lo and behold, they've got a huge malignant, inoperable, or incurable brain tumor. You can only do that, I think, a handful of times before it really starts eating away at your armor. Um, or a young mother that shows up that has a giant hemorrhage in her brain that she's not going to survive from, and they bring her 4-year-old daughter in to say goodbye one last time before they turn the ventilator off. That um, the great Henry Marsh is an English neurosurgeon who said it best. I think he says that every neurosurgeon carries with them a private graveyard, and I definitely feel that. Especially with young parents, that kills me. They had a lot more to give. The loss of those people specifically has a knock-on effect that's going to make the world worse for people for a long time, and it's just hard to feel powerless in the face of that. And that's where I think you have to be borderline evil to fight against a company like Neuralink, or to constantly be taking pot shots at us, because what we're doing is to try to fix that stuff. We're trying to give people options to reduce suffering. We're trying to take the pain out of life that broken brains brings in. And this is just our little way that we're fighting back against entropy, I guess.
Yeah, there's the amount of suffering that's endured when some of the things that we take for granted that our brain is able to do is taken away is immense. And to be able to restore some of that functionality is a real gift.
Yeah, we're just starting. We're gonna do so much more.
Well, can you take me through the full procedure for implanting, say, the N1 chip in Neuralink?
Yeah, it's a really simple, straightforward procedure. The human part of the surgery that I do is dead simple. It's one of the most basic neurosurgery procedures imaginable, and I think there's evidence that some version of it has been done for thousands of years. There are examples, I think, from ancient Egypt of healed or partially healed trephinations, and from Peru, or ancient times in South America, where these proto-surgeons would drill holes in people's skulls, presumably to let out the evil spirits, but maybe to drain blood clots. And there's evidence of bone healing around the edge, meaning the people at least survive some months after a procedure. And so what we're doing is that we are making a cut in the skin on the top of the head over the area of the brain that is the most potent representation of hand intentions. And so if you are an expert concert pianist, this part of your brain is lighting up the entire time you're playing. We call it the hand knob.
The hand knob.
Yeah.
So it's all the finger movements, all of that is just firing away.
Yep. There's a little squiggle in the cortex right there. One of the folds in the brain is kind of doubly folded right on that spot. And so you can look at it on an MRI and say, that's the hand knob. And then you do a functional test in a special kind of MRI called a functional MRI, fMRI. And this part of the brain lights up when people, even quadriplegic people whose brains aren't connected to their finger movements anymore, they imagine finger movements, and this part of the brain still lights up. So we can ID that part of the brain in anyone who's preparing to enter our trial and say, okay, that part of the brain we confirm is your hand intention area. And so I'll make a little cut in the skin. We'll flap the skin open, just like kind of opening the hood of a car, only a lot smaller. Make a perfectly round 1-inch diameter hole in the skull, remove that bit of skull, open the lining of the brain, the covering of the brain. It's like a little bag of water that the brain floats in, and then show that part of the brain to our robot. And then this is where the robot shines. It can come in and take these tiny, much smaller than human hair electrodes and precisely insert them into the cortex, into the surface of the brain to a very precise depth in a very precise spot that avoids all the blood vessels that are coating the surface of the brain. And after the robot's done with its part, then, the human comes back in and puts the implant into that hole in the skull and covers it up, screwing it down to the skull and sewing the skin back together. So the whole thing is, a few hours long. It's extremely low risk compared to the average neurosurgery involving the brain that might, say, open up a deep part of the brain or manipulate blood vessels in the brain. This opening on the surface of the brain with only cortical microinsertions carries significantly less risk than a lot of the tumor or aneurysm surgeries that are routinely done.
So cortical microinsertions that are via robot and computer vision are designed to avoid the blood vessels.
Exactly.
So I know you're a bit biased here, but let's compare human and machine.
Sure.
So what are human surgeons able to do well, and what are robot surgeons able to do well at this stage of our human civilization development?
Yeah, that's a good question. Humans are general purpose machines. We're able to adapt to unusual situations. We're able to change the plan on the fly. I remember well a surgery that I was doing many years ago down in San Diego, where the plan was to open a small hole behind the ear and go reposition a blood vessel that had come to lay on the facial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, the nerve that goes to the face. When that blood vessel lays on the nerve, it can cause just intolerable, horrific shooting pain that people describe like being zapped with a cattle prod. And so the beautiful, elegant surgery is to go move this blood vessel off the nerve. The surgery team, we went in there and started moving this blood vessel, and then found that there was a giant aneurysm on that blood vessel that was not easily visible on the pre-op scans. And so the plan had to dynamically change, and that the human surgeons had no problem with that. We're trained for all those things. Robots wouldn't do so well in that situation, at least in their current incarnation. Fully robotic surgery, like the electrode insertion portion of the Neuralink surgery, it goes according to a set plan, and so the humans can interrupt the flow and change the plan, but the robot can't really change the plan midway through. It operates according to how it was programmed and how it was asked to run. It does its job very precisely, but not with a wide degree of latitude in how to react to changing conditions.
So there could be just a very large number of ways that you could be surprised as a surgeon. When you enter a situation, there could be subtle things that you have to dynamically adjust to.
Correct.
And robots are not good at that.
Currently.
I
think we are at the dawn of a new era with AI of the parameters for robot responsiveness to be dramatically broadened, right? I mean, you can't look at a self-driving car and say that it's operating under very narrow parameters. If a chicken runs across the road, it wasn't necessarily programmed to deal with that specifically, but a Waymo or a self-driving Tesla would have no problem reacting to that appropriately. And so surgical robots aren't there yet, but give it time.
And then there could be a lot of sort of semi-autonomous possibilities of maybe a robotic surgeon could say, this situation is perfectly familiar, or the situation is not familiar, and in the not familiar case, a human could take over. But basically, like, be very conservative in saying, okay, this for sure has no issues, no surprises, and then let the humans deal with the surprises, with the edge cases, all that.
Yeah.
That's one possibility. So, like, you think eventually, you'll be out of the job. Well, you being neurosurgeon, your job being neurosurgeon. Humans, there will not be many neurosurgeons left on this earth.
I'm not worried about my job in the course of my professional life. I think I would tell my kids not necessarily to go in this line of work, depending on how things look in 20 years.
It's so fascinating because if I have a line of work, I would say it's programming. And if you ask me, like, for the last, I don't know, 20 years, what I would recommend for people, I would tell them, yeah, go. Like, there's just, you will always have a job if you're a programmer, because there's more and more computers and all this kind of stuff, and it pays well. But then you realize these large language models come along, and they're really damn good at generating code.
Yeah.
So it's overnight, you could be surprised, like, wow, like, what is the contribution of the human really? But then you start to think, okay, it does seem that humans have ability, like you said, to deal with novel situations. And in the case of programming, it's the ability to kind of come up with novel ideas to solve problems. It seems like machines aren't quite yet able to do that. And when the stakes are very high, when it's life critical, as it is in surgery, especially neurosurgery, then it starts, the stakes are very high for a robot to actually replace a human. But it's fascinating that in this case of Neuralink, there's a human robot collaboration.
Yeah. I do the parts it can't do, and it does the parts I can't do. And we are friends.
I saw that there's a lot of practice going on. So, I mean, everything in Neuralink is tested extremely rigorously. But one of the things I saw, that there's a proxy on which the surgeries are performed.
Yeah.
So this is both for the robot and for the human, for everybody involved in the entire pipeline.
Yep.
What's that like, practicing the surgery?
It's pretty intense. So there's no analog to this in human surgery. Human surgery is sort of this artisanal craft that's handed down directly from master to pupil over the generations.
Yes.
I mean, literally the way you learn to be a surgeon on humans is by doing surgery on humans. I mean, first you watch your professors do a bunch of surgery, and then finally they put, the trivial parts of the surgery into your hands, and then the more complex parts. And as your understanding of the point and the purposes of the surgery increases, you get more responsibility in the perfect condition. It doesn't always go well. In Neuralink's case, the approach is a bit different. We, of course, practiced as far as we could on animals. We did hundreds of animal surgeries. And when it came time to do the first human, we had just an amazing team of engineers build incredibly lifelike models. One of the engineers, Fran Romano in particular, built a pulsating brain in a custom 3D printed skull that matches exactly the patient's anatomy, including their face and scalp characteristics. And so when I was able to practice that, I mean, it's as close as it really reasonably should get to being the real thing in all the details, including, having a mannequin body attached to this custom head. And so when we were doing the practice surgeries, we'd wheel that body into the CT scanner and take a mock CT scan and wheel it back in and conduct all the normal safety checks, verbally, stop. This patient, we're confirming his identification is mannequin number, blah, blah, blah. And then opening the brain in exactly the right spot using standard operative neuronavigation equipment, standard surgical drills in the same OR that we do all of our practice surgeries in at Neuralink, and having the skull open and have the brain pulse, which adds a degree of difficulty for the robot perfectly precisely plan and insert those electrodes to the right depth and location. And so, we kind of broke new ground on how extensively we practiced for this surgery.
So there was a historic moment, a big milestone for Neuralink, in part for humanity, with the first human getting a Neuralink implant in January of this year. Take me through the surgery on Noland. What did it feel like to be part of this?
Yeah. Well, we're lucky to have just incredible partners at the Barrow Neurologic Institute. They are, I think, the premier neurosurgical hospital in the world. They they made everything as easy as possible for the trial to get going, and helped us immensely with their expertise on how to arrange the details. It was a much more high pressure surgery in some ways. I mean, even though the outcome wasn't particularly in question in terms of our participants' safety, the number of observers,
Right.
the number of people, there's conference rooms full of people watching live streams in the hospital, rooting for this to go perfectly. And that just adds pressure that is not typical for even the most intense production neurosurgery, say removing a tumor or, placing deep brain stimulation electrodes. And it had never been done on a human before. There were unknown unknowns. And so definitely a moderate pucker factor there for the whole team, not knowing if we were going to encounter, say, a degree of brain movement that was unanticipated, or a degree of brain sag that took the brain far away from the skull and made it difficult to insert, or some other unknown problem. Fortunately, everything went well, and that surgery was one of the smoothest outcomes we could have imagined.
Were you nervous? I mean, you're a bit of
Extremely.
a quarterback in the Super Bowl kind of situation.
Extremely nervous. Extremely. I was very pleased when it went well, and when it was over. Looking forward to number 2.
Yeah. Even with all that practice, all of that, just you've never been in a situation that's so high stakes in terms of people watching.
Yeah.
And we should also probably mention, given how the media works, a lot of people, maybe in a dark kind of way, hoping it doesn't go well.
Well, I think wealth is easy to hate, or envy, or whatever. And I think there's a whole industry around driving clicks, and bad news is great for clicks. And so any way to take an event and turn it into bad news is going to be really good for clicks.
It just sucks because I think it puts pressure on people. It discourages people from trying to solve really hard problems, because to solve hard problems, you have to go into the unknown. You have to do things that haven't been done before, and you have to take risks.
Yeah.
Calculated risks. You have to do all kind of safety precautions, but risks nevertheless. And I just wish there would be more celebration of that, of the risk taking, versus people just waiting on the sidelines, like waiting for failure.
Yeah.
And then pointing out the failure. It sucks, but in this case, it's really great that everything went just flawlessly. But it's unnecessary pressure, I would say.
Now that there's a human with literal skin in the game, there's a participant whose well-being rides on this doing well. You have to be a pretty bad person to be rooting for that to go wrong.
Yeah.
And so, hopefully people look in the mirror and realize that at some point.
So did you get to actually front row seat, watch the robot work? What, you get to see the whole thing?
Yeah. I mean, because an MD needs to be in charge of all of the medical decision-making throughout the process, I unscrubbed from the surgery after exposing the brain and presenting it to the robot, and placed the targets on the robot software interface that tells the robot where it's going to insert each thread. That was done with, my hand on the mouse for whatever that's worth.
So you were the one placing the targets.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So like the robot with the computer vision provides a bunch of candidates, and you kind of finalize the decision.
Right. The software engineers are amazing on this team, and so they actually provided an interface where you can essentially use a lasso tool and select a prime area of brain real estate, and it will automatically avoid the blood vessels in that region and automatically place a bunch of targets. So that allows the human robot operator to select really good areas of brain and make dense applications of targets in those regions, the regions we think are going to have the most high fidelity representations of finger movements and arm movement intentions.
I've seen like images of this, and for me with OCD, it's for some reason a really pleasant. I think there's a subreddit called Oddly Satisfying.
Yeah, love that subreddit.
It's oddly satisfying to see the different target sites avoiding the blood vessels, and also maximizing like the usefulness of those locations for the signal. It just feels good. It's like
As
nice.
As a person who has a visceral reaction to the brain bleeding, I can tell you
especially
it's extremely satisfying watching the electrodes themselves go into the brain and not cause bleeding.
Yeah. So you said the feeling was of relief when everything went perfectly.
Yeah.
How deep in the brain can you currently go and eventually go? Let's say on the Neuralink side, it seems the deeper you go in the brain, the more challenging it becomes.
Yeah. So talking broadly about neurosurgery, we can get anywhere. It's routine for me to put deep brain stimulating electrodes near the very bottom of the brain, entering from the top and passing about a 2 millimeter wire all the way into the bottom of the brain. And that's not revolutionary. A lot of people do that. And we can do that with very high precision. I use a robot from Globus to do that surgery, several times a month. It's pretty routine.
What are your eyes in that situation? What are you seeing? What kind of technology can you use to visualize where you are to light your way?
Yeah, so it's a cool process on the software side. You take a preoperative MRI that's extremely high resolution data of the entire brain. You put the patient to sleep, put their head in a frame that holds the skull very rigidly, and then you take a CT scan of their head while they're asleep with that frame on, and then merge the MRI and the CT in software. You have a plan based on the MRI where you can see these nuclei deep in the brain. You can't see them on CT, but if you trust the merging of the two images, then you indirectly know on the CT where that is, and therefore indirectly know where, in reference to the titanium frame screwed to their head, those targets are. And so this is 60s technology to manually compute trajectories given the entry point and target, and dial in some goofy looking titanium actuators with manual actuators with little tick marks on them. The modern version of that is to use a robot, just like a little KUKA arm you might see at building cars at the Tesla factory. This small robot arm can show you the trajectory that you intended from the pre-op MRI and establish a very rigid holder through which you can drill a small hole in the skull and pass a small rigid wire deep into that area of the brain that's hollow, and put your electrode through that hollow wire and then remove all of that except the electrode. So you end up with the electrode very, very precisely placed far from the skull surface. Now that's standard technology that's already been out in the world for a while. Neuralink right now is focused entirely on cortical targets, surface targets, because there's no trivial way to get say, hundreds of wires deep inside the brain without doing a lot of damage. So your question, what do you see? Well, I see an MRI on a screen. I can't see everything that DBS electrode is passing through on its way to that deep target. And so it's accepted with this approach that there's going to be about 1 in 100 patients who have a bleed somewhere in the brain as a result of passing that wire blindly into the deep part of the brain. That's not an acceptable safety profile for Neuralink. We start from the position that we want this to be dramatically, maybe 2 or 3 orders of magnitude safer than that. Safe enough, really, that you or I, without a profound medical problem, might on our lunch break someday say, yeah, sure, I'll get that. I've been meaning to upgrade to the latest version. And so the safety constraints given that are high. And so we haven't settled on a final solution for arbitrarily approaching deep targets in the brain.
It's interesting because you have to avoid blood vessels somehow. You have to, maybe there's creative ways of doing the same thing, like mapping out high resolution geometry of blood vessels, and then you can go in blind. But how do you map out that in a way that's super stable? There's a lot of interesting challenges there, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot to do on the surface, luckily.
Exactly. So we've got vision on the surface. We actually have made a huge amount of progress sewing electrodes into the spinal cord as a potential workaround for a spinal cord injury that would allow a brain-mounted implant to translate motor intentions to a spine-mounted implant that can affect muscle contractions in previously paralyzed arms and legs.
That's mind-blowing. That's just incredible. So the effort there is to try to bridge the brain to the spinal cord to the peripheral nervous system. So how hard is that to do?
We have that working in very crude forms in animals.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we've done
so similar to with Nolan, where he's able to digitally move the cursor. Here you're doing the same kind of communication, but with the actual effectors that you have.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So we have anesthetized animals doing grasp and moving their legs in a sort of walking pattern. Again, early days, but the future is bright for this kind of thing. And people with paralysis should look forward to that bright future. They're going to have options.
Yeah, and there's a lot of sort of intermediate or extra options where you take an Optimus robot, like the arm, and to be able to control the arm.
Yeah.
The fingers, the hands of the arm.
Sure.
As a prosthetic. For
Exoskeletons are getting better too.
Exoskeletons. Yeah, so that goes hand in hand. Although I didn't quite understand until thinking about it deeply and doing more research about Neuralink, how much you can do on the digital side. So there's digital telepathy.
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand that you can really map the intention, as you described in the hand knob area, that you can map the intention. Just imagine it, think about it. That intention can be mapped to actual action in the digital world.
Right.
And now more and more, so much can be done in the digital world that it can reconnect you to the outside world. It can allow you to have freedom, have independence if you're a quadriplegic.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. You can go really far with that.
Yeah. Our first participant he's incredible. He's breaking world records left and right.
And he's having fun with it. It's great. Yeah. Just going back to the surgery, your whole journey, you mentioned to me offline you have surgery on Monday. So you're doing surgery all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe the ridiculous question, what does it take to get good at surgery?
Practice, repetitions. Same with anything else. There's a million ways of people saying the same thing and selling books saying it, but do you call it 10,000 hours? Do you call it, spend some chunk of your life, some percentage of your life focusing on this, obsessing about getting better at it? Repetitions, humility, recognizing that you aren't perfect at any stage along the way, recognizing you've got improvements to make in your technique, being open to feedback and coaching from people with a different perspective on how to do it. And then just the constant will to do better. That fortunately, if you're not a sociopath, I think your patients bring that with them to the office visits every day. They, force you to want to do better all the time.
Yeah, just step up. I mean, it's a real human being that you can help.
Yeah.
So every surgery, even if it's the same exact surgery, is there a lot of variability between that surgery and a different person?
Yeah, a fair bit. I mean, a good example for us is the angle of the skull relative to the normal plane of the body axis of the skull over hand knob is pretty wide variation. I mean, some people have really flat skulls and some people have really steeply angled skulls over that area. And that has, consequences for how their head can be fixed in sort of the frame that we use, and how the robot has to approach the skull. And people's bodies are built as differently as the people you see walking down the street. As much variability in body shape and size as you see there, we see in brain anatomy and skull anatomy. There are some people who we've had to kind of exclude from our trial for having skulls that are too thick or too thin, or scalp that's too thick or too thin. I think, we have like the middle 97% or so of people, but you can't account for all human anatomy variability.
How much like mushiness and mess is there? Because I, taking biology classes, the diagrams are always really clean and crisp. Neuroscience, the pictures of neurons are always really nice and very. Yeah. But whenever I look at pictures of like real brains, they're all, I don't know what is going on.
Yeah.
So how much are biological systems in reality? Like, how hard is it to figure out what's going on?
Not too bad. Once you really get used to this, that's where experience and skill and education really come into play. Is if you stare at 1,000 brains, it becomes easier to kind of mentally peel back say, for instance, blood vessels that are obscuring the sulci and gyri, kind of the wrinkle pattern of the surface of the brain. Occasionally, when you're first starting to do this and you open the skull, it doesn't match what you thought you were going to see based on the MRI. And with more experience, you learn to kind of peel back that layer of blood vessels and see the underlying pattern of wrinkles in the brain, and use that as a landmark for where you are.
The wrinkles are a landmark? So
yeah. So I was describing hand knob earlier. That's a pattern of the wrinkles in the brain. It's sort of this sort of Greek letter omega shaped area of the brain.
So you could recognize the hand knob area, like if I show you 1,000 brains and give you like 1 minute with each, you'd be like, yep, that's that.
Sure.
And so there is some uniqueness to that area of the brain, like in terms of the geometry, the topology of the thing.
Yeah.
Where is it about in the...
It's so you have this strip of brain running down the top, called the primary motor area. And I'm sure you've seen this picture of the homunculus laid over the surface of the brain, the weird little guy with huge lips and giant hands. That guy sort of lays with his legs up at the top of the brain, and face, arm areas farther down, and then some kind of mouth, lip, tongue areas farther down. And so the hand is right in there, and then the areas that control speech, at least on the left side of the brain, in most people are just below that. And so any muscle that you voluntarily move in your body, the vast majority of that references that strip, or those intentions come from that strip of brain, and the wrinkle for hand knob is right in the middle of that.
And vision is back here.
Yep.
Also close to the surface.
Vision's a little deeper. And so, this gets to your question about how deep can you get. Um, to do vision, we can't just do the surface of the brain. We have to be able to go in, not as deep as we'd have to go for DBS, but maybe a centimeter deeper than we're used to for hand insertions. And so that's, work in progress. That's a new set of challenges to overcome.
By the way, you mentioned the Utah array, and I just saw a picture of that, and that thing looks terrifying.
Yeah,
because it's because it's rigid, and then if you look at the threads, they're flexible. What can you say that's interesting to you about that kind of approach of the flexible threads to deliver the electrodes next to the neurons?
Yeah, I mean the goal there comes from experience. I mean, we stand on the shoulders of people that made Utah arrays and used Utah arrays for decades before we ever even came along. Neuralink arose partly, this approach to technology arose out of a need recognized after Utah arrays would fail routinely because the rigid electrodes, those spikes that are literally hammered using an air hammer into the brain, those spikes generate a bad immune response that encapsulates the electrode spikes in scar tissue, essentially. And so one of the projects that was being worked on in the Anderson lab at Caltech when I got there was to see if you could use chemotherapy to prevent the formation of scar. It's like, things are pretty bad when you're jamming a bed of nails into the brain and then treating that with chemotherapy to try to prevent scar tissue. It's like, maybe we've gotten off track here, guys. Maybe there's a fundamental redesign necessary. And so Neuralink's approach of using highly flexible, tiny electrodes avoids a lot of the bleeding, avoids a lot of the immune response that ends up happening when rigid electrodes are pounded into the brain. And so what we see is our electrode longevity and functionality and the health of the brain tissue immediately surrounding the electrode is excellent. I mean, it goes on for years now in our animal models.
What do most people not understand about the biology of the brain? We'll mention the vasculature. That's really interesting.
I think the most interesting, maybe underappreciated fact is that it really does control almost everything. I mean, I don't know, for out of the blue example, imagine you want a lever on fertility. You want to be able to turn fertility on and off. I mean, there are legitimate targets in the brain itself to modulate fertility. Say, blood pressure. You want to modulate blood pressure. There are legitimate targets in the brain for doing that. Things that aren't immediately obvious as brain problems are potentially solvable in the brain. And so I think it's an underexplored area for primary treatments of all the things that bother people.
That's a really fascinating way to look at it. Like, there's a lot of conditions we might think have nothing to do with the brain, but they might just be symptoms of something that actually started in the brain. The actual source of the problem, the primary source is something in the brain.
Yeah, not always. I mean, their kidney disease is real, but there are levers you can pull in the brain that affect all of these systems.
There's knobs.
Yeah.
On-off switches and knobs in the brain, from which this all originates. Yeah. Would you have a Neuralink chip implanted in your brain?
Yeah. I think use case right now is use a mouse, right? I can already do that. And so there's no value proposition. On safety grounds alone, sure, I would do it tomorrow.
You say the use case of the mouse. Because after researching all this, and part of it is just watching Nolan have so much fun. If you can get that bits per second really high with a mouse, being able to interact, because if you think about the way on the smartphone, the way you swipe, that was transformational.
Yeah.
How we interact with the thing. It's subtle. You don't realize it, but to be able to touch a phone and to scroll with your finger, that's like that changed everything. People were sure you need a keyboard to type, and that there's a lot of HCI aspects to that changed how we interact with computers. So there could be a certain rate of speed with the
Yeah.
mouse that would change everything.
Yeah.
It's like you might be able to just click around a screen extremely fast, and that if it, I can see myself getting the Neuralink for much more rapid interaction with the digital devices.
Yeah. I think recording speech intentions from the brain might change things as well. You know, the value proposition for the average person. A keyboard is a pretty clunky human interface, requires a lot of training. It's, you know, highly variable in the maximum performance that the average person can achieve. I think taking that out of the equation and just having a natural, you know, word to computer interface might change things for a lot of people.
That'd be hilarious if that is the reason people do it. Even if you have speech to text that's extremely accurate, it currently isn't.
Right.
But it's say gotten super accurate. It'd be hilarious if people went for Neuralink just so you avoid the embarrassing aspect of speaking, like looking like a douchebag speaking to your phone in public, which is a real, like, that's a real constraint.
Yeah. I mean, with a bone conducting case that can be an invisible headphone, say, and the ability to think words into software and have it respond to you, you know, that starts to sound sort of like embedded superintelligence. You know, if you can silently ask for the Wikipedia article on any subject and have it read to you without any observable change happening in the outside world. You know, for one thing, standardized testing is obsolete.
Yeah. If it's done well on the UX side, it could change. I don't know if it transforms society, but it really can create a kind of shift in the way we interact with digital devices in the way that a smartphone did. Now, I would, just having to look into the safety of everything involved, I would totally try it. So it doesn't have to go to some like incredible thing where you have it connects your vision or to some other, like it connects all over your brain. That could be like just connecting to the hand knob. You might have a lot of interesting interaction, human computer interaction possibilities.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And the technology on the academic side is progressing at light speed here. I think there was a really amazing paper out of UC Davis, Sergei Stavitsky's lab, that basically made an initial solve of speech decode. It was something like 125,000 words that they were getting with, you know, very high accuracy, which is...
So you're just thinking the word?
Yeah.
Thinking the word and you're able to get it.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Like you have to have the intention of speaking it.
Right.
So like do that inner voice. Man, it's so amazing to me that you can do the intention to signal mapping. All you have to do is just imagine yourself doing it. And if you get the feedback that it actually worked, you can get really good at that. Like your brain will first of all adjust, and you develop it like any other skill.
Yeah.
Like touch typing, you develop in that same kind of way. That is to me, it's just really fascinating.
Yeah.
To be able to even to play with that. Honestly, like I would get a Neuralink just to be able to play with that. Just to play with the capacity, the capability of my mind to learn this skill. It's like learning the skill of typing or learning the skill of moving a mouse. It's another skill of moving the mouse, not with my physical body, but with my mind.
I can't wait to see what people do with it. I feel like we're cavemen right now. We're like banging rocks with a stick and thinking that we're making music. At some point, when these are more widespread, there's going to be the equivalent of a piano that, you know, someone can make art with their brain in a way that we didn't even anticipate. I'm looking forward to it.
Give it to like a teenager. Like anytime I think I'm good at something, I'll always go to like, I don't know, even with the bits per second of playing a video game, you realize you give it to a teenager, you give a Neuralink to a teenager, just a large number of them, the kind of stuff they get good at stuff. They're gonna get like hundreds of bits per second.
Yeah,
Even just with the current technology.
probably.
Just because it's also addicting. How the number go up aspect of it, of like improving and training, because it's almost like a skill. And plus, there's the software on the other end that adapts to you. And especially if the adapting procedure, the algorithm becomes better and better and better, you like learning together.
Yeah, we're scratching the surface on that right now. There's so much more to do.
So on the complete other side of it, you have an RFID chip implanted in you.
Yeah.
So I hear.
Yeah.
Nice. So this is
little subtle thing.
It's a passive device that you use for unlocking like a safe with top secrets, or what do you use it for? What's the story behind it?
I'm not the first one. There's there's this whole community of weirdo biohackers that have done this stuff, and I think one of the early use cases was storing, private crypto wallet keys and whatever. I dabbled in that a bit and had some fun with it.
You have some Bitcoin implanted in your body somewhere, you can't tell where.
Yeah, actually, yeah. It was, the modern day equivalent of finding change in the sofa cushions. After I put some orphan crypto on there that I thought was worthless and forgot about it for a few years, went back and found that some community of people loved it and had propped up the value of it. And so it had gone up 50-fold. Wow. So there was a lot of change in those cushions.
That's hilarious.
But the primary use case is mostly as a tech demonstrator. It has my business card on it. You can scan that in by touching it to your phone. It opens the front door to my house. Whatever, simple stuff.
But it's a cool step. It's a cool leap to implant something in your body. I mean, it's a similar leap to a Neuralink. Because for a lot of people, that kind of notion of putting something inside your body, something electronic inside a biological system, is a big leap.
Yeah, we have a kind of a mysticism around the barrier of our skin. We're completely fine with knee replacements, hip replacements, dental implants. But there's a mysticism still around the inviolable barrier that the skull represents. And I think that needs to be treated like any other pragmatic barrier. The question isn't how incredible is it to open the skull? The question is, what benefit can we provide?
So from all the surgeries you've done, from everything you understand the brain, how much does neuroplasticity come into play? How adaptable is the brain? For example, just even in the case of healing from surgery or adapting to the post-surgery situation?
The answer that is sad for me and other people of my demographic is that, plasticity decreases with age, healing decreases with age. Yeah. I have too much gray hair to be optimistic about that. There are theoretical ways to increase plasticity using electrical stimulation. Nothing that is, totally proven out as a robust enough mechanism to offer widely to people. But I think there's cause for optimism that we might find something useful in terms of, say, an implanted electrode that improves learning. Certainly, there's been some really amazing work recently from Nicholas Schiff, Jonathan Baker, and others who have a cohort of patients with moderate traumatic brain injury who have had electrodes placed in the deep nucleus in the brain called the centromedian nucleus, or just near the centromedian nucleus. And when they apply small amounts of electricity to that part of the brain, it's almost like electronic caffeine. They're able to improve people's attention and focus. They're able to improve how well people can perform a task. I think in one case, someone who was unable to work after the device was turned on, they were able to get a job. And that's sort of, one of the holy grails for me with Neuralink and other technologies like this is, from a purely utilitarian standpoint, can we make people able to take care of themselves and their families economically again? Can we make it so someone who's fully dependent and even maybe requires a lot of caregiver resources, can we put them in a position to be fully independent, taking care of themselves, giving back to their communities? Um, I think that's a very compelling proposition, and what motivates a lot of what I do and what a lot of the people at Neuralink are working for.
It's just a cool possibility that if you put a Neuralink in there, that the brain adapts, like the other part of the brain adapts too.
Yeah.
And integrates it. The capacity of the brain to do that is really interesting. Probably unknown to the degree to which it can do that. But you're now connecting an external thing to it, especially once it's doing stimulation. Like the biological brain and the electronic brain outside of it working together, like the possibilities there are really interesting.
Yeah.
It's still unknown, but interesting. It feels like the brain is really good at adapting to whatever.
Yeah.
But of course, it is a system that by itself is already like everything serves a purpose. And so you don't want to mess with it too much.
Yeah. It's like, eliminating a species from an ecology. You don't know what the delicate interconnections and dependencies are. The brain is certainly a delicate, complex beast, and we don't know, every potential downstream consequence of a single change that we make.
Do you see yourself doing, so you mentioned P1 surgeries of P2, P3, P4, P5, just more and more and more humans?
I think, it's a certain kind of brittleness or a failure on the company's side if we need me to do all the surgeries. I think something that I would very much like to work towards is a process that is so simple and so robust on the surgery side that literally anyone could do it. We want to get away from requiring intense expertise or intense experience to have this successfully done and make it as simple and translatable as possible. I mean, I would love it if every neurosurgeon on the planet had no problem doing this. I think we're probably far from a regulatory environment that would allow people that aren't neurosurgeons to do this, but not impossible.
All right, I'll sign up for that. Did you ever anthropomorphize the robot R1? Like, do you give it a name? Do you see it as like a friend that's like working together with you?
I mean, to a certain degree,
or an enemy who's going to take your job?
To a certain degree, it's a complex relationship.
All the good relationships are.
It's funny when in the middle of the surgery, there's a part of it where I stand basically shoulder to shoulder with the robot. And so, if you're in the room reading the body language, it's my brother in arms there. We're working together on the same problem. Yeah, I'm not threatened by it.
Keep telling yourself that. Yeah. How have all the surgeries that you've done over the years, the people you've helped, and the stakes, the high stakes that you've mentioned, how has that changed your understanding of life and death?
Yeah. It gives you a very visceral sense, and this may sound trite, but it gives you a very visceral sense that death is inevitable. On one hand, you are, as a neurosurgeon, you're deeply involved in these like just hard to fathom tragedies. Young parents dying, leaving, a 4-year-old behind, say. And on the other hand, it takes the sting out of it a bit because you see how just mind-numbingly universal death is. There's zero chance that I'm going to avoid it. I know, techno-optimists right now and longevity buffs right now would disagree on that 0.000% estimate. But I don't see any chance that our generation is going to avoid it. entropy is a powerful force, and we are very ornate, delicate, brittle DNA machines that aren't up to the cosmic ray bombardment that we're subjected to. So, on the one hand, every human that has ever lived died or will die. On the other hand, it's just one of the hardest things to imagine inflicting on anyone that you love is having them gone. I mean, I'm sure you've had friends that aren't living anymore, and it's hard to even think about them. And so I wish I had, arrived at the point of nirvana where, death doesn't have a sting. I'm not worried about it, but I can at least say that I'm comfortable with the certainty of it. If not having found out how to take the tragedy out of it when I think about, my kids, either not having me or me not having them or my wife.
Maybe I've come to accept the intellectual certainty of it, but and maybe the pain that comes with losing the people you love. I don't think I've come to understand the existential aspect of it, like that this is going to end. And I don't mean like in some trite way. I mean like it certainly feels like it's not going to end. Like you live life like it's not going to end.
Right.
And the fact that this light that's shining, this consciousness is going to no longer be in one moment, maybe today. It's like it fills me when I really am able to load all that in with Ernest Becker's terror. Like it's a real fear. I think people aren't always honest with how terrifying it is.
Yeah.
I think the more you are able to really think through it, the more terrifying it is. It's not such a simple thing. Oh, well, it's the way life is. And if you really can load that in, it's hard. But I think that's why the Stoics did it, because it like helps you get your shit together and be like this. Well, like the moment, every single moment you're alive is just beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's terrifying that it's going to end. And it's like you're like almost like you're shivering in the cold. A child, helpless, this kind of feeling.
Yeah.
And then it makes you, when you have warmth, when you have the safety, when you have the love, to really appreciate it. I feel like sometimes in your position, when you mentioned armor, just to see death, it might make you not be able to see that, the finiteness of life, because if you kept looking at that, it might break you. So it's good to know that you're kind of still struggling with that. There's the neurosurgeon, and then there's a human.
Yeah.
And the human is still able to struggle with that and feel the fear of that and the pain of that.
Yeah. It definitely makes you ask the question of how many of these can you see and not say, I can't do this anymore. But I mean, you said it well. I think it gives you an opportunity to just appreciate that you're alive today. And, I've got 3 kids and an amazing wife, and I'm really happy. Things are good. I get to help on a project that I think matters. I think it moves us forward. I'm a very lucky person.
It's the early steps of a potentially gigantic leap for humanity. It's a really interesting one. And it's cool because like you read about all this stuff in history where it's like the early days. I've been reading, before going to the Amazon, I would read about explorers that would go and explore even the Amazon jungle for the first time. It's just, those are the early steps.
Yeah.
Or early steps into space, early steps in any discipline, in physics and mathematics. And it's cool because this is like on the grand scale, these are the early steps into delving deep into the human brain. So not just observing the brain, but be able to interact with the human brain.
Yeah.
It's going to help a lot of people, but it also might help us understand what the hell's going on in there.
Yeah. I think ultimately we want to give people more levers that they can pull, right? Like you want to give people options. If you can give someone a dial that they can turn on how happy they are, I think that makes people really uncomfortable. But now talk about major depressive disorder, talk about people that are committing suicide at an alarming rate in this country, and try to justify that queasiness in that light of you can give people a knob to take away suicidal ideation, suicidal intention. I would give them that knob. I don't know how you justify not doing that.
Yeah, you can think about like all the suffering that's going on in the world. Like every single human being that's suffering right now, it's like it'll be a glowing red dot. The more suffering, the more it's glowing, and you just see the map of human suffering. And any technology that allows you to dim that light of suffering on a grand scale is pretty exciting, because there's a lot of people suffering, and most of them suffer quietly,
Yeah.
and we turn we look away too often, and we should remember those that are suffering, because once again, most of them are suffering quietly.
Well, and on a grander scale, the fabric of society. People have a lot of complaints about how our social fabric is working or not working, how our politics is working or not working. Those things are made of neurochemistry too, in aggregate, right? Like our politics is composed of individuals with human brains, and the way it works or doesn't work is potentially tunable, in the sense that, I don't know, say remove our addictive behaviors or tune our addictive behaviors for social media, or our addiction to outrage, our addiction to sharing the most angry political tweet we can find. I don't think that leads to a functional society. And if you had options for people to moderate that maladaptive behavior, there could be huge benefits to society. Maybe we could all work together a little more harmoniously toward useful ends.
There's a sweet spot, like you mentioned. You don't want to completely remove all the dark sides of human nature, because those kind of are somehow necessary to make the whole thing work. But there's a sweet spot.
Yeah, I agree. You gotta suffer a little, just not so much that you lose hope.
Yeah. When all the surgeries you've done, have you seen consciousness in there ever? Was there like a glowing light?
I have this sense that I never found it.
Okay.
Never removed it. Like a Dementor in Harry Potter. I have this sense that consciousness is a lot less magical than our instincts want to claim it is. It seems to me like a useful analog for thinking about what consciousness is in the brain. Is that we have a really good intuitive understanding of what it means to, say, touch your skin and know what's being touched. I think consciousness is just that level of sensory mapping applied to the thought processes in the brain itself. So what I'm saying is consciousness is the sensation of some part of your brain being active. So you feel it working. You feel the part of your brain that thinks of red things or winged creatures or the taste of coffee. You feel those parts of your brain being active the way that I'm feeling my palm being touched, right? And that sensory system that feels the brain working is consciousness.
That's so brilliant. It's the same way, it's the sensation of touch when you're touching a thing. Consciousness is the sensation of you feeling your brain working, your brain thinking, your brain perceiving.
Which isn't like a warping of space-time or some quantum field effect, right? It's nothing magical. People always want to ascribe to consciousness something truly different. And there's this awesome long history of people looking at whatever the latest discovery in physics is to explain consciousness. because it's the most magical, the most out there thing that you can think of. And people always, want to do that with consciousness. I don't think that's necessary. It's just a very useful and gratifying way of feeling your brain work.
And as we said, it's one heck of a brain.
Yeah.
Everything we see around us, everything we love, everything that's beautiful came from brains like these.
It's all electrical activity happening inside your skull.
And I, for one, am grateful that there's people like you that are exploring all the ways that it works and all the ways it can be made better.
Thanks,
Matthew,
Lex.
thank you so much for talking today.
It's been a joy.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Matthew McDougall. And now, dear friends, here's Bliss Chapman, Brain Interface Software Lead at Neuralink. You told me that you've met hundreds of people with spinal cord injuries or with ALS, and that your motivation for helping at Neuralink is grounded in wanting to help them. Can you describe this motivation?
Yeah. First, just a thank you to all the people I've gotten a chance to speak with for sharing their stories with me. I don't think there's any world really in which I can share their stories in as powerful a way as they can. But just I think to summarize at a very high level, what I hear over and over again is that people with ALS or severe spinal cord injury in a place where they basically can't move physically anymore, really at the end of the day are looking for independence. And that can mean different things for different people. For some folks, it can mean the ability just to be able to communicate again independently without needing to wear something on their face, without needing a caretaker to be able to put something in their mouth. For some folks, it can mean independence to be able to work again, to be able to navigate a computer digitally efficiently enough to be able to get a job, to be able to support themselves, to be able to move out and ultimately be able to support themselves after their family maybe isn't there anymore to take care of them. And for some folks, it's as simple as just being able to respond to their kid in time before they, run away or get interested in something else. And these are deeply personal and sort of very human problems. And what strikes me again and again when talking with these folks is that this is actually an engineering problem. This is a problem that with the right resources, with the right team, we can make a lot of progress on. And at the end of the day, I think that's a deeply inspiring message and something that makes me excited to get up every day.
So it's both an engineering problem in terms of a BCI, for example, that can give them capabilities where they can interact with the world. But also on the other side, it's an engineering problem for the rest of the world to make it more accessible for people living with quadriplegia.
Yeah. And actually, I'll take a broad view sort of lens on this for a second. I think I'm very in favor of anyone working in this problem space. So beyond BCI, I'm happy and excited and willing to support in any way I can folks working on eye tracking systems, working on speech to text systems, working on head trackers or mouse sticks or quad sticks. And I've met many engineers and folks in the community that do exactly those things. And I think for the people we're trying to help, it doesn't matter what the complexity of the solution is as long as the problem is solved. And I want to emphasize that there can be many solutions out there that can help with these problems. And BCI is one of a collection of such solutions. So BCI in particular, I think, offers several advantages here. And I think the folks that recognize this immediately are usually the people who have spinal cord injury or some form of paralysis. Usually you don't have to explain to them why this might be something that could be helpful. It's usually pretty self-evident. But for the rest of us, folks that don't live with severe spinal cord injury or who don't know somebody with ALS, it's not often obvious why you would want a brain implant to be able to connect and navigate a computer. And it's surprisingly nuanced to the degree that I've learned a huge amount just working with Noland in the first Neuralink clinical trial and understanding from him and his words why this device is impactful for him. And it's a nuanced topic. It can be the case that even if you can achieve the same thing, for example, with a mouse stick when navigating a computer, he doesn't have access to that mouse stick every single minute of the day. He only has access when someone is available to put it in front of him. And so a BCI can really offer a level of independence and autonomy that if it wasn't literally physically part of your body, it would be hard to achieve in any other way.
So there's a lot of fascinating aspects to what it takes to get Nolan to be able to control a cursor on the screen with his mind. You texted me something that I just love. You said, I was part of the team that interviewed and selected P1. I was in the operating room during the first human surgery, monitoring live signals coming out of the brain. I work with the user basically every day to develop new UX paradigms, decoding strategies, and I was part of the team that figured out how to recover useful BCI to new world record levels when the signal quality degraded. We'll talk about, I think, every aspect of that, but just zooming out, what was it like to be a part of that, part of that team and part of that historic, I would say, historic first?
Yeah, I think for me, this is something I've been excited about for close to 10 years now. And so to be able to be even just some small part of making it a reality is extremely exciting. A couple maybe special moments during that whole process that I'll never really truly forget. One of them is during the actual surgery. At that point in time, I know Nolan quite well. I know his family. And so I think the initial reaction when Nolan is rolled into the operating room is just a, oh shit kind of reaction. But at that point, muscle memory kicks in and you sort of go into, you let your body just do all the talking. And I have the lucky job in that particular procedure to just be in charge of monitoring the implant. So my job is to sit there, to look at the signals coming off the implant, to look at the live brain data streaming off the device as threads are being inserted into the brain, and just to basically observe and make sure that nothing is going, wrong, or that there's no red flags or fault conditions that we need to go and investigate or pause the surgery to debug. And because I had that sort of spectator view of the surgery, I had a slightly removed perspective than I think most folks in the room. I got to sit there and think to myself, wow, that brain is moving a lot. When you look inside the little craniectomy that we stick the threads in, one thing that most people don't realize is the brain moves. Mm-hmm. The brain moves a lot when you breathe, when your heart beats, and you can see it visibly. So, that's something that I think was a surprise to me and very, very exciting to be able to see someone's brain who you physically know and have talked with at length actually pulsing and moving inside their skull.
And they used that brain to talk to you previously. Yes. And now it's right there moving.
Yep.
Actually, I didn't realize that in terms of the thread sending. So the Neuralink implant is active during surgery. So, and one thread at a time, you're able to start seeing the signal.
Yeah.
So that's part of the way you test that the thing is working.
Yeah. So actually in the operating room, right after we sort of finished all the thread insertions, I started collecting what's called broadband data. So broadband is basically the most raw form of signal you can collect from a Neuralink electrode. It's essentially a measurement of the local field potential, or the voltage essentially measured by that electrode. And we have a certain mode in our application that allows us to visualize where detected spikes are. So it visualizes sort of where in the broadband signal, in its very, very raw form of the data, a neuron is actually spiking. And so one of these moments that I'll never forget as part of this whole clinical trial is seeing live in the operating room while he's still under anesthesia, beautiful spikes being shown in the application, just streaming live to a device I'm holding in my hand.
So this is no signal processing, the raw data, and then the signals processing's on top of it. You're seeing the spikes detected.
Right, yeah.
And that's a UX too.
Yes.
That looks beautiful as well.
During that procedure, there was actually a lot of cameramen in the room, so they also were curious and wanted to see. There's several neurosurgeons in the room who are all just excited to see robots taking their job. And they're all, crowded around a small little iPhone watching this live brain data stream out of his brain.
What was that like, seeing the robot do some of the surgery? So the computer vision aspect where it detects all the spots that avoid the blood vessels, and then obviously with human supervision, then actually doing the really high precision connection of the threads to the brain.
Yeah, it's a good question. My answer is going to be pretty lame here, but it was boring.
Yeah.
I've seen it so many times. Yeah, that's exactly how you want surgery to be. You want it to be boring.
Yeah.
Because I've seen it so many times. I've seen the robot do this surgery literally hundreds of times. And so it was just one more time.
Yeah, all the practice surgeries and the proxies. And this is just another day.
Yeah.
So what about when Nolan woke up? Well, do you remember a moment where he was able to move the cursor, not move the cursor, but get signal from the brain such that it was able to show that there's a connection?
Yeah. Yeah. So we are quite excited to move as quickly as we can. And Nolan was really, really excited to get started. He wanted to get started actually the day of surgery. But we waited till the next morning. very patiently. It's a long night. And the next morning in the ICU, where he was recovering, he wanted to get started and actually start to understand what kind of signal we can measure from his brain. And maybe for folks who are not familiar with the Neuralink system, we implant the Neuralink system or the Neuralink implant in the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is responsible for representing things like motor intent. So if you imagine closing and opening your hand, that kind of signal representation would be present in the motor cortex. If you imagine moving your arm back and forth or wiggling a pinky, this sort of signal can be present in the motor cortex. So one of the ways we start to sort of map out what kind of signal do we actually have access to in any particular individual's brain is through this task called body mapping. And body mapping is where you essentially present a visual to the user and you say, hey, imagine doing this. And the visual is, a 3D hand opening and closing or index finger modulating up and down. And you ask the user to imagine that. And obviously you can't see them do this because they're paralyzed. So you can't see them actually move their arm. But while they do this task, you can record neural activity. And you can basically offline model and check, can I predict or can I detect the modulation corresponding with those different actions? And so we did that task and we realized, hey, there's actually some modulation associated with some of his hand motion, which was a first indication that, okay, we can potentially use that modulation to do useful things in the world. For example, control a computer cursor. And he started playing with it, the first time we showed him it. And we actually just took the same live view of his brain activity and put it in front of him. And we said, hey, you tell us what's going on. Mm-hmm. We're not you. You're able to imagine different things. And we know that it's modulating some of these neurons. So you figure out for us what that is actually representing. And so he played with it for a bit. He was like, I don't quite get it yet. He played for a bit longer. And he said, oh, when I move this finger, I see this particular neuron start to fire more. And I said, okay, prove it. Do it again. And so he said, okay, 3, 2, 1, boom. Mm-hmm. And the minute he moved, you can see like instantaneously, this neuron is firing. Single neuron. I can tell you the exact channel number if you're interested. It's stuck in my brain now forever. But that single channel firing was a beautiful indication that it was behaviorally modulated neural activity that could then be used for downstream tasks like decoding a computer cursor.
And when you say single channel, is that associated with a single electrode?
Yeah, so channel and electrode are interchangeable.
And there's 1,024 of those.
1,024, yeah.
It's incredible that works. That really, when I was learning about all this and like loading it in, it was just blowing my mind that the intention, you can visualize yourself moving the finger, that can turn into a signal. And the fact that you can then skip that step and visualize the cursor moving or have the intention of the cursor moving and that leading to a signal that can then be used to move the cursor. There is so many exciting things there to learn about the brain, about the way the brain works. The very fact of their existing signal that can be used is really powerful.
Yep.
But it feels like that's just like the beginning of figuring out how that signal can be used really, really effectively. I should also just, there's so many fascinating details here, but you mentioned the body mapping step. At least in the version I saw that Nolan was showing off, there's like a super nice interface, like a graphical interface. Yeah. Like, it just felt like I was like in the future because it like, I guess it visualizes you moving the hand. Yep. And there's a very like a sexy polished interface that hello. Yeah. I don't know if there's a voice component, but it just felt like it's like when you wake up in a really nice video game and this is a tutorial at the beginning of that video game. Yeah. This is what you're supposed to do. It's cool.
No, I mean, the future should feel like the future.
But it's not easy to pull that off. I mean, it needs to be simple, but not too simple.
Yeah, and I think the UX design component here is underrated for BCI development in general. There's a whole interaction effect between the ways in which you visualize an instruction to the user and the kinds of signal you can get back. And that quality of sort of your behavioral alignment to the neural signal is a function of how good you are at expressing to the user what you want them to do. And so, yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about the UX of how we build our applications, of how the decoder actually functions, the control surfaces it provides to the user. All these little details matter a lot.
So maybe it'd be nice to get into a little bit more detail of what the signal looks like and what the decoding looks like. Yeah. So there's a N1 implant that has, like we mentioned, 1,024 electrodes, and that's collecting raw data, raw signal. What does that signal look like? And what are the different steps along the way before it's transmitted and what is transmitted, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yep. This is going to be a fun one.
Let's go.
Maybe before diving into what we do, it's worth understanding what we're trying to measure because that dictates a lot of the requirements for the system that we build. And what we're trying to measure is really individual neurons producing action potentials. An action potential is, you can think of it like a little electrical impulse that you can detect if you're close enough. And by being close enough, I mean like within, let's say, 100 microns of that cell. And 100 microns is a very, very tiny distance. And so the number of neurons that you're going to pick up with any given electrode is just a small radius around that electrode. Mm-hmm. And the other thing worth understanding about the underlying biology here is that when neurons produce an action potential, the width of that action potential is about 1 millisecond. So from the start of the spike to the end of the spike, that whole width of that sort of characteristic feature of a neuron firing is 1 millisecond wide. And if you want to detect that an individual spike is occurring or not, you need to sample that signal or sample the local field potential nearby that neuron much more frequently than once a millisecond. You need to sample many, many times per millisecond to be able to detect that this is actually the characteristic waveform of a neuron producing an action potential. Mm-hmm. And so we sample across all 1,024 electrodes about 20,000 times a second. 20,000 times a second means for every given 1 millisecond window, we have about 20 samples that tell us what that exact shape of that action potential looks like. Mm-hmm. And once we've sort of sampled at super high rate the underlying electrical field nearby these cells, we can process that signal into just where do we detect a spike or where do we not? Sort of a binary signal, 1 or 0. Do we detect a spike in this 1 millisecond or not? And we do that because the actual information carrying sort of subspace of neural activity is just when are spikes occurring. Mm-hmm. Essentially, everything that we care about for decoding can be captured or represented in the frequency characteristics of spike trains, meaning how often are spikes firing in any given window of time. And so that allows us to do sort of a crazy amount of compression from this very rich, high density, signal to something that's much, much more sparse and compressible that can be sent out over a wireless radio, like a Bluetooth communication, for example.
Quick tangents here. You mentioned electrode neuron. There's a local neighborhood of neurons nearby. How difficult is it to isolate from where the spike came from?
Yeah, so there's a whole field of sort of academic neuroscience work on exactly this problem of basically given a single electrode or given a set of electrodes measuring a set of neurons, how can you sort of spike sort mm-hmm. which spikes are coming from what neuron? And this is a problem that's pursued in academic work because you care about it for understanding what's going on in the underlying sort of neuroscience of the brain. If you care about understanding how the brain's representing information, how that's evolving through time, then that's a very, very important question to understand. For sort of the engineering side of things, at least at the current scale, if the number of neurons per electrode is relatively small, you can get away with basically ignoring that problem completely. You can think of it like sort of a random projection of neurons to electrodes. And there may be, in some cases, more than one neuron per electrode. But if that number is small enough, those signals can be thought of as sort of a union of the two. Mm-hmm. And for many applications, that's a totally reasonable trade-off to make and can simplify the problem a lot. And as you sort of scale out channel count, the relevance of distinguishing individual neurons becomes less important because you have more overall signal and you can start to rely on sort of correlations or covariance structure in the data to help understand when that channel is firing, what does that actually represent? Because you know that when that channel is firing in concert with these other 50 channels, that means move left. But when that same channel is firing with concert with these other 10 channels, that means move right.
Okay, so you have to do this kind of spike detection on board. And you have to do that super efficiently, so fast and not use too much power because you don't want to be generating too much heat. So it have to be a super simple signal processing step.
Yeah.
Is there some wisdom you can share about what it takes to overcome that challenge?
Yeah. So we've tried many different versions of basically turning this raw signal into sort of a feature that you might want to send off the device. And I'll say that I don't think we're at the final step of this process. This is a long journey. We have something that works clearly today, but there can be many approaches that we find in the future that are much better than what we do right now. So some versions of what we do right now, and there's a lot of academic heritage to these ideas, so I don't want to claim that these are original Neuralink ideas or anything like that. But one of these ideas is basically to build a sort of like a convolutional filter almost, if you will, that slides across the signal and looks for a certain template to be matched. And that template consists of sort of how deep the spike modulates, how much it recovers, and what the duration and window of time is that the whole process takes. And if you can see in the signal that that template is matched within certain bounds, then you can say, okay, that's a spike. One reason that approach is super convenient is that you can actually implement that extremely efficiently in hardware, which means that you can run it in low power across 1,024 channels all at once. Another approach that we've recently started exploring, and this can be combined with the spike detection approach, is something called spike band power. And the benefits of that approach are that you may be able to pick up some signal from neurons that are maybe too far away to be detected as a spike, because the farther away you are from an electrode, the weaker that actual spike waveform will look like on that electrode. So you might be able to pick up, population level activity of things that are, maybe slightly outside the normal recording radius, what neuroscientists sometimes refer to as the hash of activity, the other stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
And you can look at sort of across many channels how that sort of background noise is behaving, and you might be able to get more juice out of the signal that way. But it comes at a cost. That signal is now a floating point representation, which means it's more expensive to send out over power. It means you have to find different ways to compress it that are different than what you can apply to binary signals. So there's a lot of different challenges associated with these different modalities.
So also in terms of communication, you're limited by the amount of data you can send.
Yeah.
So, and also because you're currently using the Bluetooth protocol, you have to batch stuff together. But you have to also do this keeping the latency crazy low. Like crazy low. Anything to say about the latency?
Yeah, this is a passion project of mine. So I want to build the best mouse in the world.
Yeah.
I don't want to build like the Chevrolet Spark or whatever of electric cars. I want to build like the Tesla Roadster version of a mouse. And I really do think it's quite possible that within 5 to 10 years that most esports competitions are dominated by people with paralysis. This is like a very real possibility for a number of reasons. One is that they'll have access to the best technology to play video games effectively. The second is they have the time to do so. So those two factors together are particularly potent for esport competitors.
Unless people without paralysis are also allowed to implant neuralink,
right?
Which is another way to interact with a digital device. Mm-hmm. And there's something to that. If it's a fundamentally different experience, more efficient experience, even if it's not like some kind of full-on high bandwidth communication, if it's just the ability to move the mouse 10x faster, like the bits per second, if I can achieve a bits per second at 10x what I can do with the mouse, that's a really interesting possibility of what that can do, especially as you get really good at it with training.
It's definitely the case that you have a higher ceiling of performance. Because you don't have to buffer your intention through your arm, through your muscle, you get just by nature of having a brain implant at all, like 75 millisecond lead time on any action that you're actually trying to take. And there's some nuance to this, like there's evidence that the motor cortex, you can sort of plan out sequences of actions, so you may not get that whole benefit all the time. But for sort of like reaction time style games where you just want to, somebody's over here, snipe them, that kind of thing, you actually do have just an inherent advantage because you don't need to go through muscle. So the question is just how much faster can you make it? And we're already, faster than what you would do if you're going through muscle from a latency point of view. And we're in the early stages of that. I think we can push it. Sort of our end-to-end latency right now from brain spike to cursor movement is about 22 milliseconds. If you think about the best mice in the world, the best gaming mice, that's about 5 milliseconds-ish of latency, depending on how you measure, depending how fast your screen refreshes. There's a lot of characteristics that matter there. But yeah, and the rough time for like a neuron in the brain to actually impact your command of your hand is about 75 milliseconds. So if you look at those numbers, you can see that we're already competitive and slightly faster than what you'd get by actually moving your hand. And this is something that, if you ask Nolan about it, when he moved the cursor for the first time, we asked him about this. It was something I was super curious about. Like, what does it feel like when you're modulating, a click intention or when you're trying to just move the cursor to the right? He said it moves before he is like actually intending it to, which is kind of a surreal thing and something that, I would love to experience myself one day. What is that like to have the thing just be so immediate, so fluid that it feels like it's happening before you're actually intending it to move?
Yeah, I suppose we've gotten used to that latency, that natural latency that happens. So is currently the bottleneck the communication? So like the Bluetooth communication, what's the actual bottleneck? I mean, there's always going to be a bottleneck, but what's the current bottleneck?
Yeah, a couple things. So kind of hilariously, Bluetooth low energy protocol has some restrictions on how fast you can communicate. So the protocol itself establishes a standard of, the most frequent sort of updates you can send are on the order of 7.5 milliseconds. And as we push latency down to the level of sort of individual spikes impacting control, that level of resolution, that kind of protocol is going to become a limiting factor at some scale. Another sort of important nuance to this is that it's not just the Neuralink itself that's part of this equation. If you start pushing latency sort of below the level of how fast screens refresh, then you have another problem. Like you need your whole system to be able to be as reactive as the sort of limits of what the technology can offer.
Yes.
Like you need the screen, like 120 hertz just doesn't, work anymore if you're trying to have something respond at something that's, at the level of 1 millisecond.
That's a really cool challenge. I also like that for a t-shirt, the best mouse in the world. Tell me on the receiving end, so the decoding step. Now we figured out what the spikes are. We got them all together. Now we're sending that over to the app. What's the decoding step look like?
Yeah. So maybe first, what is decoding? I think there's probably a lot of folks listening that just have no clue what it means to decode brain activity.
Actually, even if we zoom out beyond that, what is the app? So there's an implant that's wirelessly communicating with any digital device that has an app installed.
Yep.
So maybe can you tell me at high level what the app is, what the software is outside of the brain?
Yeah. So maybe working backwards from the goal. The goal is to help someone with paralysis, in this case, Nolan, be able to navigate his computer independently. And we think the best way to do that is to offer them the same tools that we have to navigate our software, because we don't want to have to rebuild an entire software ecosystem for the brain, at least not yet. Maybe someday you can imagine there's UXs that are built natively for BCI, but in terms of what's useful for people today, I think most people would prefer to be able to just control mouse and keyboard inputs to all the applications that they want to use for their daily jobs, for communicating with their friends, etc. And so the job of the application is really to translate this wireless stream of brain data coming off the implant into control of the computer. And we do that by essentially building a mapping from brain activity to sort of the HID inputs to the actual hardware. So HID is just the protocol for communicating like input device events. So for example, move mouse to this position or press this key down. And so that mapping is fundamentally what the app is responsible for. But there's a lot of nuance of how that mapping works that we spend a lot of time to try to get right. And we're still in the early stages of a long journey to figure out how to do that optimally. So one part of that process is decoding. So decoding is this process of taking the statistical patterns of brain data that's being channeled across this Bluetooth connection to the application and turning it into, for example, a mouse movement. And that decoding step, you can think of it in a couple different parts. So similar to any machine learning problem, there's a training step and there's an inference step. The training step in our case is a very intricate behavioral process where the user has to imagine doing different actions. So for example, they'll be presented a screen with a cursor on it, and they'll be asked to push that cursor to the right. Then imagine pushing that cursor to the left, push it up, push it down. And we can basically build up a pattern, or using any sort of modern ML method, a mapping of given this brain data and that imagined behavior, map one to the other. And then at test time, you take that same pattern matching system. In our case, it's a deep neural network, and you run it, and you take the live stream of brain data coming off their implant, you decode it by pattern matching to what you saw at calibration time, and you use that for control of the computer. Now, a couple like sort of rabbit holes that I think are quite interesting. One of them has to do with how you build that best template matching system, because there's a variety of behavioral challenges and also debugging challenges when you're working with someone who's paralyzed. Because again, fundamentally, you don't observe what they're trying to do. You can't see them attempt to move their hand. And so you have to figure out a way to instruct the user to do something and validate that they're doing it correctly, such that then you can downstream build with confidence the mapping between the neural spikes and the intended action. And by doing the action correctly, what I really mean is at the level of resolution of what neurons are doing. So if in an ideal world, you could get a signal of behavioral intent that is ground truth accurate at the scale of sort of 1 millisecond resolution, then with high confidence, I could build a mapping from my neural spikes to that behavioral intention. But the challenge is, again, that you don't observe what they're actually doing. And so there's a lot of nuance to how you build user experiences that give you more than just sort of a coarse, on average, correct representation of what the user's intending to do. If you want to build the world's best mouse, you really want it to be as responsive as possible. You want it to be able to do exactly what the user's intending at every sort of step along the way, not just on average be correct when you're trying to move it from left to right. And building a behavioral sort of calibration game or sort of software experience that gives you that level of resolution is what we spend a lot of time working on.
So the calibration process, the interface has to encourage precision, meaning like whatever it does, it should be super intuitive, that the next thing the human is going to likely do is exactly that intention that you need, and only that intention.
Yeah.
And you don't have any feedback except that maybe speaking to you afterwards what they actually did. You can't. Oh yeah.
Right.
So that's fundamentally, that is a really exciting UX challenge, because that's all on the UX. It's not just about being friendly or nice or usable.
Yeah.
It's like,
User experience is how it works.
it's how it works.
Yeah.
For the calibration, and calibration, at least at this stage of Neuralink, is like fundamental to the operation of the thing. And not just calibration, but continued calibration, essentially.
Yeah. And maybe
Wow, yeah.
you said something that I think is worth exploring there a little bit. You said it's, primarily a UX challenge. And I think a large component of it is, but there is also a very interesting machine learning challenge here, which is given some, data set, including some on average correct behavior of asking the user to move up or move down, move right, move left. And given a data set of neural spikes, is there a way to infer in some kind of semi-supervised or entirely unsupervised way what that high resolution version of their intention is? And if you think about it, like there probably is, because there are enough data points in the data set, enough constraints on your model, that there should be a way with the right sort of formulation to let the model figure out itself. For example, at this millisecond, this is exactly how hard they're pushing upwards. And at this millisecond, this is how hard they're trying to push upwards.
It's really important to have very clean labels. Yes. So like the problem becomes much harder from the machine learning perspective if the labels are noisy.
That's correct.
And then to get the clean labels, that's a UX challenge.
Correct. Although clean labels, I think maybe it's worth exploring what that exactly means. I think any given labeling strategy will have some number of assumptions it makes about what the user is attempting to do. Those assumptions can be formulated in a loss function, or they can be formulated in terms of heuristics that you might use to just try to estimate or guesstimate what the user is trying to do. And what really matters is how accurate are those assumptions. For example, you might say, hey, user, push upwards and follow the speed of this cursor. And your heuristic might be that they're trying to do it exactly what that cursor is trying to do. Another competing heuristic might be they're actually trying to go slightly faster at the beginning of the movement and slightly slower at the end. And those competing heuristics may or may not be accurate reflections of what the user is trying to do. Another version of the task might be, hey, user, imagine moving this cursor a fixed offset. So rather than follow the cursor, just try to move it exactly 200 pixels to the right. So here's the cursor, here's the target. Okay, cursor disappears. Try to move that now invisible cursor 200 pixels to the right. And the assumption in that case would be that the user can actually modulate correctly that position offset. But that position offset assumption might be a weaker assumption, and therefore potentially you can make it more accurate than these heuristics that are trying to guesstimate at each millisecond what the user is trying to do. So you can imagine different tasks that make different assumptions about the nature of the user intention, and those assumptions being correct is what I would think of as a clean label.
For that step, what are we supposed to be visualizing? There's a cursor, and you want to move that cursor to the right, the left, up and down, or maybe move them by a certain offset. So that's one way. Is that the best way to do calibration? So for example, an alternative crazy way that probably is playing a role here is a game like WebGrid, where you're just getting a very large amount of data, the person playing a game, where if they are in a state of flow, maybe you can get clean signal as a side effect.
Yep.
Is that not an effective way for initial calibration?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot to unpack there. So the first thing I would draw a distinction between is sort of open loop versus closed loop. So open loop, what I mean by that is the user is sort of going from 0 to 1. They have no model at all, and they're trying to get to the place where they have some level of control at all. In that setup, you really need to have some task that gives the user a hint of what you want them to do, such that you can build this mapping again from brain data to output. Then once they have a model, you could imagine them using that model and actually adapting to it and figuring out the right way to use it themselves, and then retraining on that data to give you sort of a boost in performance. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of challenges associated with both of these techniques, and we can sort of rabbit hole into both of them if you're interested. But the sort of challenge with the open loop task is that the user themselves doesn't get proprioceptive feedback about what they're doing. They don't, necessarily perceive themselves or feel, the mouse under their hand when they're using an open loop, or when they're trying to do an open loop calibration. They're being asked to perform something like, imagine if you sort of had your whole right arm numbed and you stuck it in a box and you couldn't see it. So you had no visual feedback and you had no proprioceptive feedback about what the position or activity of your arm was. And now you're asked, okay, given this thing on the screen that's moving from left to right, match that speed. And you basically can try your best to, invoke whatever that imagined action is in your brain that's moving the cursor from left to right. But in any situation, you're going to be inaccurate and maybe inconsistent in how you do that task. And so that's sort of the fundamental challenge of open loop. The challenge with closed loop is that once the user's given a model and they're able to start moving the mouse on their own, they're going to very naturally adapt to that model. And that co-adaptation between the model learning what they're doing and the user learning how to use the model may not find you the best sort of global minima. It may be that your first model was noisy in some ways, or maybe just had some like quirk. Like there's some like part of the data distribution it didn't cover super well. And the user now figures out, because they're a brilliant user like Nolan, they figure out the right sequence of imagined motions or the right angle they have to hold their hand at to get it to work. And they'll get it to work great. But then the next day they come back to their device and maybe they don't remember exactly all the tricks that they used the previous day. And so there's a complicated sort of feedback cycle here that can emerge and can make it a very, very difficult debugging process.
Okay, there's a lot of really fascinating things there. Actually, just to stay on the closed loop, I've seen situations. This actually happened watching psychology grad students. They use a piece of software when they don't know how to program themselves. They use a piece of software that somebody else wrote, and it has a bunch of bugs. And they figure out and they've been using it for years.
Yeah.
They figure out ways to work around it. Oh, that just happens. Like nobody like considers maybe we should fix this. They just adapt. And that's a really interesting notion that we're really good at adapting, but you need to still, that might not be the optimal.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you solve that problem? Do you have to restart from scratch every once in a while kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. First and foremost, I would say this is not a solved problem. And for anyone who's listening in academia who works on BCIs, I would also say this is not a problem that's solved by simply scaling channel count. So this is, maybe that can help, and you can get sort of richer covariance structures that you can use to exploit when trying to come up with good labeling strategies. But if you're interested in problems that aren't going to be solved inherently by just scaling channel count, this is one of them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you solve it? It's not a solved problem. That's the first thing I want to make sure it gets across. The second thing is any solution that involves closed loop is going to become a very difficult debugging problem. And one of my sort of general heuristics for choosing what problems to tackle is that you want to choose the one that's going to be the easiest to debug. Because if you can do that, even if the ceiling is lower, you're going to be able to move faster because you have a tighter iteration loop debugging the problem. And in the open loop setting, there's not a feedback cycle to debug with the user in the loop. And so there's some reason to think that that should be an easier debugging problem. The other thing that's worth understanding is that even in a closed loop setting, there's no special sauce or magic of how to infer what the user is truly attempting to do. In the closed loop setting, although they're moving the cursor on the screen, they may be attempting something different than what your model is outputting. So what the model is outputting is not a signal that you can use to retrain if you want to be able to improve the model further. You still have this very complicated guesstimation or unsupervised problem of figuring out what is the true user intention underlying that signal. And so the open loop problem has the nice property of being easy to debug, and the second nice property of it has all the same information and content as the closed loop scenario. Another thing I want to mention and call out is that this problem doesn't need to be solved in order to give useful control to people. Even today with the solutions we have now and that academia has built up over decades, the level of control that can be given to a user, today is quite useful. It doesn't need to be solved to get to that level of control. But again, I want to build the world's best mouse. I want to make it, so good that it's not even a question that you want it. And to build the world's best mouse, the superhuman version, you really need to nail that problem. And a couple maybe details of previous studies that we've done internally that I think are very interesting to understand when thinking about how to solve this problem. The first is that even when you have ground truth data of what the user is trying to do, and you can get this with an able-bodied monkey, a monkey that has a Neuralink device implanted and moving a mouse to control a computer, even with that ground truth data set, it turns out that the optimal thing to predict to produce high-performance BCI is not just the direct control of the mouse. You can imagine, building a data set of what's going on in the brain and what is the mouse exactly doing on the table. And it turns out that if you build the mapping from neural spikes to predict exactly what the mouse is doing, that model will perform worse than a model that is trained to predict sort of higher level assumptions about what the user might be trying to do. For example, assuming that the monkey is trying to go in a straight line to the target. It turns out that making those assumptions is actually more effective in producing a model than actually predicting the underlying hand movement.
So the intention, not the physical movement or whatever.
Yeah.
There's obviously a really strong correlation between the two, but the intention is a more powerful thing to be chasing.
Right.
Well, that's also super interesting. I mean, the intention itself is fascinating because, yes, with the BCI here in this case, with the digital telepathy, you're acting on the intention, not the action, which is why there's an experience of like feeling like it's happening before you meant for it to happen. That is so cool. And that is why you could achieve like superhuman performance probably in terms of the control of the mouse. So for open loop, just to clarify, so whenever the person is tasked to like move the mouse to the right, you said there's not feedback. So they don't get to get that satisfaction of like actually getting it to move, right?
So you could imagine giving the user feedback on a screen, but it's difficult because at this point you don't know what they're attempting to do. So what can you show them that would basically give them a signal of I'm doing this correctly or not correctly? So let's take a very specific example. Like maybe your calibration task looks like you're trying to move the cursor a certain position offset. So your instructions to the user are, hey, the cursor's here. Now, when the cursor disappears, imagine moving it 200 pixels from where it was to the right to be over this target. In that kind of scenario, you could imagine coming up with some sort of consistency metric that you could display to the user of, okay, I know what the spike train looks like on average when you do this action to the right. Maybe I can produce some sort of probabilistic estimate of how likely is that to be the action you took given the latest trial or trajectory that you imagined. And that could give the user some sort of feedback of how consistent are they across different trials. You could also imagine that if the user is prompted with that kind of consistency metric, that maybe they just become more behaviorally engaged to begin with because the task is kind of boring when you don't have any feedback at all. And so there may be benefits to the user experience of showing something on the screen, even if it's not accurate, just because it keeps the user motivated to try to increase that number or push it upwards.
So there's a psychology element here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, all of that is UX challenge. How much signal drift is there? Hour to hour, day to day, week to week, month to month? How often do you have to recalibrate because of the signal drift?
Yeah. So this is a problem we've worked on both with NHP, non-human primates, before our clinical trial, and then also with Noland during the clinical trial. Maybe the first thing that's worth stating is what the goal is here. So the goal is really to enable the user to have a plug-and-play experience where, I guess they don't have to plug anything in, but a play experience where they can use the device whenever they want to, however they want to. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we're aiming for. And so there can be a set of solutions that get to that state without considering this non-stationarity problem. So maybe the first solution here that's important is that they can recalibrate whenever they want. This is something that that Nolan has the ability to do today. So he can recalibrate the system, at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night without his, caretaker or parents or friends around to help push a button for him. The other important part of the solution is that when you have a good model calibrated, that you can continue using that without needing to recalibrate it. So how often he has to do this recalibration today depends really on his appetite for performance. There are, we observe a sort of a degradation through time of how well any individual model works, but this can be mitigated behaviorally by the user adapting their control strategy. It can also be mitigated through a combination of sort of software features that we provide to the user. For example, we let the user adjust exactly how fast the cursor is moving. We call that the gain, for example, the gain of how fast the cursor reacts to any given input intention. They can also adjust the smoothing, how smooth the output of that cursor intention actually is. They can also adjust the friction, which is how easy is it to stop and hold still. And all these software tools allow the user a great deal of flexibility and troubleshooting mechanisms to be able to solve this problem for themselves.
By the way, all of this is done by looking to the right side of the screen, selecting the mixer, and in the mixer you have it's
like DJ mode. DJ mode for your BCI.
So, I mean, it's a really well done interface. It's really, really well done. And so, yeah, there's that bias that there's a cursor drift that Nolan talked about in a stream. Although he said that you guys were just playing around with it with him and they're constantly improving. So that could have been just a snapshot of that particular moment, a particular day. But he said that there was this cursor drift and this bias that could be removed by him, I guess, looking to the right side of the screen, the left side of the screen to kind of adjust the bias.
Yeah.
That's one interface action, I guess, to adjust the bias.
Yeah. So this is actually an idea that comes out of academia. There is some prior work with sort of BrainGate clinical trial participants where they pioneered this idea of bias correction. The way we've done it, I think, is it's very productized, very beautiful user experience where the user can essentially flash the cursor over to the side of the screen and it opens up a window where they can actually sort of adjust or tune exactly the bias of the cursor. So bias, maybe for people who aren't familiar, is just sort of what is the default motion of the cursor if you're imagining nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that that's one of the first sort of qualia of the cursor control experience that's impacted by neural non-stationarity.
Qualia of the cursor experience.
I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. Like, I'm not the guy moving.
Very poetic. I love it. The quality of the cursor experience. Yeah, I mean, it sounds poetic, but it is deeply true. There is an experience when it works well. It is a joyful, a really pleasant experience, and when it doesn't work well, it's a very frustrating experience. That's actually the art of UX. It's like you have the possibility to frustrate people or the possibility to give them joy.
And at the end of the day, it really is truly the case that UX is how the thing works. And so it's not just like what's showing on the screen. It's also, what control surfaces does a decoder provide the user? Like we want them to feel like they're in the F1 car, not like some like minivan, right? And that really truly is how we think about it. Nolan himself is an F1 fan. So we refer to ourselves as a pit crew. He really is truly the F1 driver. And there's different, control surfaces that different kinds of cars and airplanes provide the user. And we take a lot of inspiration from that when designing how the cursor should behave. And maybe one nuance of this is, even details like when you move a mouse on a MacBook trackpad, the sort of response curve of how that input that you give the trackpad translates to cursor movement is different than how it works with a mouse. Mm-hmm. When you move on the trackpad, there's a different response function, a different curve to how much a movement translates to input to the computer than when you do it physically with a mouse. And that's because somebody sat down a long time ago when they're designing the initial input systems to any computer, and they thought through exactly how it feels to use these different systems. And now we're designing sort of the next generation of this input system to a computer, which is entirely done via the brain. And there's no proprioceptive feedback. Again, you don't feel the mouse in your hand. You don't feel the keys under your fingertips. And you want a control surface that still makes it easy and intuitive for the user to understand the state of the system and how to achieve what they want to achieve. And ultimately, the end goal is that UX is it fades into the background. It becomes something that's so natural and intuitive that it's subconscious to the user. And they just should feel like they have basically direct control over the cursor. It just does what they want it to do. They're not thinking about the implementation of how to make it do what they want it to do. It's just doing what they want it to do.
Is there some kind of things along the lines of like Fitts Law where you should move the mouse in a certain kind of way that maximizes your chance to hit the target? I don't even know what I'm asking, but I'm hoping the intention of my question will land on a profound answer. No. Is there some kind of understanding of the laws of UX when it comes to the context of somebody using their brain to control it? Like that's different than actual with a mouse.
I think we're in the early stages of discovering those laws. So I wouldn't claim to have solved that problem yet. But there's definitely some things we've learned that make it easier for the user to get stuff done. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty straightforward when you verbalize it, but it takes a while to actually get to that point when you're in the process of debugging this stuff in the trenches. One of those things is that any machine learning system you build has some number of errors. And it matters how those errors translate to the downstream user experience. For example, if you're developing a search algorithm in your photos, if you search for your friend Joe and it pulls up a photo of your friend Josephine, maybe that's not a big deal because the cost of an error is not that high. In a different scenario where you're trying to detect insurance fraud or something like this, and you're directly sending someone to court because of some machine learning model output, then the errors make a lot more sense to be careful about. You want to be very thoughtful about how those errors translate to downstream effects. The same is true in BCI. So, for example, if you're building a model that's decoding a velocity output from the brain versus an output where you're trying to modulate the left click, for example, these have sort of different trade-offs of how precise you need to be before it becomes useful to the end user. For velocity, it's okay to be on average correct because the output of the model is integrated through time. So if the user's trying to click at position A and they're currently at position B, they're trying to navigate over time to get between those 2 points. And as long as the output of the model is on average correct, they can sort of steer it through time with the user control loop in the mix. They can get to the point they want to get to. The same is not true of a click. For a click, you're performing it almost instantly at the scale of neurons firing. And so you want to be very sure that click is correct because a false click can be very destructive to the user. They might accidentally close the tab that they're trying to do something in and lose all their progress. They might accidentally hit some send button on some text that is only like half composed and reads funny after, So, there's different sort of cost functions associated with errors in this space. And part of the UX design is understanding how to build a solution that is, when it's wrong, still useful to the end user.
That's so fascinating that assigning cost to every action when an error occurs. So every action, if an error occurs, has a certain cost. And incorporating that into how you interpret the intention, mapping it to the action, is really important. I didn't quite, until you said it, realize there's a cost to like sending the text early. It's like a very expensive cost.
It's super annoying. If you accidentally, like if your cursor, imagine if your cursor misclicked every once in a while. That's like super obnoxious. And the worst part of it is, usually when the user's trying to click, they're also holding still because they're over the target they want to hit and they're getting ready to click, which means that in the data sets that we build, on average, is the case that sort of low speeds or desire to hold still is correlated with when the user's attempting to click.
Wow, that is really fascinating.
It's also not the case, people think that, a click is a binary signal. This must be super easy to decode. Well, yes, it is, but the bar is so much higher for it to become a useful thing for the user. And there's ways to solve this. I mean, you can sort of take the cop-out approach of, well, let's just let's take 5 seconds to click. Let's take a huge window of time so we can be very confident about the answer. Yeah. But again, world's best mouse. The world's best mouse doesn't take a second to click or 500 milliseconds to click. It takes 5 milliseconds to click or less. And so if you're aiming for that kind of high bar, then you really want to solve the underlying problem.
So maybe this is a good place to ask about how to measure performance, this whole bits per second. What can you explain what you mean by that? Maybe a good place to start is to talk about WebGrid as a game, as a good illustration of the measurement of performance.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take one zoom out step there, which is just explaining why we care to measure this at all. So again, our goal is to provide the user the ability to control the computer as well as I can, and hopefully better. And that means that they can do it at the same speed as what I can do. It means that they have access to all the same functionality that I have, including all those little details like command tab, command space, all this stuff. They need to be able to do it with their brain. And with the same level of reliability as what I can do with my muscles. And that's a high bar. And so we intend to measure and quantify every aspect of that to understand how we're progressing towards that goal. There's many ways to measure BPS, by the way. This isn't the only way. But we present the user a grid of targets, and basically we compute a score, which is dependent on how fast and accurately they can select, and then how small are the targets. And the more targets that are on the screen, the smaller they are, the more information you present per click. And so if you think about it from an information theory point of view, you can communicate across different information theoretic channels. And one such channel is a typing interface, you could imagine, that's built out of a grid, just like a software keyboard on the screen. And bits per second is a measure that's computed by taking the log of the number of targets on the screen. You can subtract 1 if you care to model a keyboard, because you have to subtract 1 for the delete key on the keyboard. But log of the number of targets on the screen times the number of correct selections minus incorrect, divided by some time window, for example, 60 seconds. And that's sort of the standard way to measure a cursor control task in academia. And all credit in the world goes to this great professor, Dr. Shenoy of Stanford, who came up with that task. And he's also one of my inspirations for being in the field. So all the credit in the world to him for coming up with a standardized metric to facilitate this kind of bragging rights that we have now to say that Nolan is the best in the world at this task with its BCI. It's very important for progress that you have standardized metrics that people can compare across different techniques and approaches. How well does this do? So yeah, big kudos to him and to all the team at Stanford. So for Nolan and for me playing this task, there's also different modes that you can configure this task. So the WebGrid task can be presented as just sort of a left click on the screen, or you could have targets that you just dwell over, or you could have targets that you left, right click on. You could have targets that are left, right click, middle click, scrolling, clicking and dragging. You can do all sorts of things within this general framework. But the simplest, purest form is just blue targets show up on the screen. Blue means left click. That's the simplest form of the game. And the sort of prior records here in academic work and at Neuralink internally with sort of NHPs have all been matched or beaten by Nolan with his Neuralink device. So sort of prior to Neuralink, the sort of world record for a human using the device is somewhere between 4.2 to 4.6 BPS, depending on exactly what paper you read and how you interpret it. Nolan's current record is 8.5 BPS. And again, the sort of median Neuralinker performance is 10 BPS. So you can think of it roughly as he's 85% the level of control of a median Neuralinker using their cursor to select blue targets on the screen. And I think there's a very interesting journey ahead to get us to that same level of 10 BPS performance. It's not the case that sort of the tricks that got us from 4 to 6 BPS and then 6 to 8 BPS are going to be the ones that get us from 8 to 10. And in my view, the core challenge here is really the labeling problem. It's how do you understand at a very, very fine resolution what the user is attempting to do. And I highly encourage folks in academia to work on this problem.
What's the journey with Nolan on that quest of increasing the BPS on WebGrid? In March, you said that he selected 89,285 targets in WebGrid.
Yep.
So he loves this game. He's really serious about improving his performance in this game. So what is that journey of trying to figure out how to improve that performance? How much can that be done on the decoding side? How much can that be done on the calibration side? How much can that be done on the Nolan side of like figuring out how to convey his intention more cleanly?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So in my view, one of the primary reasons why Nolan's performance is so good is because of Nolan.
Mm-hmm.
Nolan is extremely focused and very energetic. He'll play WebGrid sometimes for like 4 hours in the middle of the night, like from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. He'll be playing WebGrid just because he wants to push it to the limits of what he can do. And, this is not us like asking him to do that. I want to be clear. Like we're not saying, hey, you should play WebGrid tonight. We just gave him the game as part of our research, and he is able to play independently and practice whenever he wants. And he really pushes hard to push the technology to the absolute limit. And he views it as like, his job really to make us be the bottleneck. And boy, has he done that well. And so that's the first thing to acknowledge is that, he is extremely motivated to make this work. I've also had the privilege to meet other, clinical trial participants from BrainGate and other trials, and they very much share the same attitude of like, they view this as their life's work to, advance the technology as much as they can. And if that means selecting targets on the screen for 4 hours from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., then so be it. And there's something extremely admirable about that that's worth calling out. Okay, so now how do you sort of get from where he started, which is no cursor control, to 8 BPS? So, when he started, there's a huge amount of learning to do on his side and our side to figure out what's the most intuitive control for him. And the most intuitive control for him is you have to find the set intersection of what do we have the signal to decode. So we don't pick up, every single neuron in the motor cortex, which means we don't have representation for every part of the body. So there may be some signals that we have better sort of decode performance on than others. For example, on his left hand, we have a lot of difficulty distinguishing his left ring finger from his left middle finger.
Mm-hmm.
But on his right hand, we have a good control and good modulation detected from the neurons that we're able to record for his pinky and his thumb and his index finger. So you can imagine how these different, subspaces of modulated activity intersect with what's the most intuitive for him. And this has evolved over time. So once we gave him the ability to calibrate models on his own, he was able to go and explore various different ways to imagine controlling the cursor. For example, he could imagine controlling the cursor by wiggling his wrist side to side, or by moving his entire arm. I think at one point he did his feet. He tried like a whole bunch of stuff to explore the space of what is the most natural way for him to control the cursor that at the same time is easy for us to decode reliably.
Just to clarify, it's through the body mapping procedure that you're able to figure out which finger he can move?
Yes, that's one way to do it. Maybe one nuance of when he's doing it, he can imagine many more things than we represent in that visual on the screen. Mm-hmm. So we show him sort of abstractly, here's a cursor. You figure out what works the best for you. And we obviously have hints about what will work best from that body mapping procedure of, we know that this particular action we can represent well, but it's really up to him to go and explore and figure out what works the best.
But at which point does he no longer visualize the movement of his body and is just visualizing the movement of the cursor?
Yeah.
How quickly does he go from, how quickly does he get there?
So this happened on a Tuesday. I remember this day very clearly because at some point during the day, it looked like he wasn't doing super well. Like it looked like the model wasn't performing super well and he was like getting distracted. But it wasn't the case. Like what actually happened was he was trying something new where he was just controlling the cursor. So he wasn't imagining moving his hand anymore. He was just imagining, I don't know what it is, some like abstract intention to move the cursor on the screen. And I cannot tell you what the difference between those two things are. I really, truly cannot. He's tried to explain it to me before. I cannot, give a first-person account of what that's like. But the expletives that he uttered in that moment were, enough to suggest that it was a very qualitatively different experience for him to just have direct neural control over a cursor.
I wonder if there's a way through UX to encourage a human being to discover that. Because he discovered it, like you said to me, that he's a pioneer. So he discovered that on his own through all of this, the process of trying to move the cursor with different kinds of intentions. But that is clearly a really powerful thing to arrive at, which is to let go of trying to control the fingers and the hand and control the actual digital device with your mind.
That's right. UX is how it works. And the ideal UX is one that the user doesn't have to think about what they need to do in order to get it done. It just does it.
That is so fascinating. But I wonder on the biological side, how long it takes for the brain to adapt.
Yeah.
So is it just simply learning like high level software, or is there like a neuroplasticity component where like the brain is adjusting slowly?
Yeah. The truth is I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to see with sort of the second participant that we implant what the journey is like for them, because we'll have learned a lot more. Potentially we can help them understand and explore that direction more quickly. This is something I didn't, this wasn't me prompting Nolan to go try this. He was just exploring how to use his device and figured it out himself. But now that we know that that's a possibility, that maybe there's a way to, for example, hint the user, don't try super hard during calibration. Just do something that feels natural, or just directly control the cursor. Don't imagine explicit action. And from there, we should be able to hopefully understand how this is for somebody who has not experienced that before. Maybe that's the default mode of operation for them. You don't have to go through this intermediate phase of explicit motions.
Or maybe if that naturally happens for people, you can just occasionally encourage them to allow themselves to move the cursor.
Right.
Actually, sometimes just like with a 4-minute mile, just the knowledge that that's possible.
Yes. Pushes you to do it.
Enables you to do it. And then it becomes trivial. And then it also makes you wonder, this is the cool thing about humans. Once there's a lot more human participants, they will discover things that are possible.
Yes. And share their experiences.
Yeah, and share
each other.
Yeah. And that because of them sharing it, they'll be able to do it. All of a sudden, that's unlocked for everybody.
Yeah.
Because just the knowledge sometimes is the thing that enables it to do it.
Yeah. I mean, and just to comment on that too, like we've probably tried like 1,000 different ways to do various aspects of decoding. And now we know like what the right subspace is to continue exploring further. Again, thanks to Nolan and the many hours he's put into this. And so even just that help constrain sort of the beam search of different approaches that we could explore really helps accelerate for the next person, the set of things that we'll get to try on day one, how fast we hope to get them to useful control, how fast we can enable them to use it independently and to get value out of the system. So yeah, massive hats off to Nolan and all the participants that came before him to make this technology a reality.
So how often are the updates to the decoder? Because Nolan mentioned okay, there's a new update that we're working on, and that in the stream he said he plays the snake game because it's like super hard. It's a good way for him to test how good the update is. So, and he says sometimes the update is a step backwards. It's it's a constant iteration. So how often, what does the update entail? Is it most on the decoder side?
Yeah, a couple comments. So one is, it's probably worth drawing distinction between sort of research sessions where we're actively trying different things to understand what the best approach is, versus sort of independent use where we wanted to have ability to just go use the device how anybody would want to use their MacBook. And so what he's referring to is, I think, usually in the context of a research session where we're trying many, many different approaches to, even unsupervised approaches like we talked about earlier to try to come up with better ways to estimate his true intention and more accurately decode it. And in those scenarios, I mean, we try in any given session, he'll sometimes work for 8 hours a day. Yeah. And so that can be, hundreds of different models that we would try in that day, a lot of different things. Now, it's also worth noting that we update the application he uses quite frequently. I think, sometimes up to 4 or 5 times a day, we'll update his application with different features or bug fixes or feedback that he's given us. So he's a very articulate person who is part of the solution. He's not a complaining person. He says, hey, here's this thing that I've discovered is not optimal in my flow. Here's some ideas how to fix it. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let's figure out how to solve it. And it often happens that those things are addressed within a couple hours of him giving us his feedback, because that's the kind of iteration cycle we'll have. And so sometimes at the beginning of the session he'll give us feedback, and at the end of the session he's giving us feedback on the next iteration of that process or that setup.
That's fascinating, because one of the things you mentioned that there was 271 pages of notes taken from the BCI sessions, and this was just in March. So one of the amazing things about human beings that they can provide, especially ones who are smart and excited and all positive and good vibes like Nolan, that they can provide feedback, continuous feedback.
Yeah. It also requires, just to brag on the team a little bit, I work with a lot of exceptional people. And it requires the team being absolutely laser focused on the user and what will be the best for them. And it requires like a level of commitment of, okay, this is what the user feedback was. I have all these meetings. We're going to skip that today and we're going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
That level of focus and commitment is, I would say, underappreciated in the world. And also, you obviously have to have the talent to be able to execute on these things effectively. And we have that in loads.
Yeah, and this is such a interesting space of UX design because there's so many unknowns here. And I can tell UX is difficult because of how many people do it poorly. It's just not a trivial thing.
Yeah. It's also, UX is not something that you can always solve by just constant iterating on different things. Like sometimes you really need to step back and think globally, am I even in like the right sort of minima to be chasing down for a solution? Like there's a lot of problems in which sort of fast iteration cycle is the predictor of how successful you will be. As a good example, like in an RL simulation, for example, the more frequently you get reward, the faster you can progress. It's just an easier learning problem the more frequently you get feedback. But UX is not that way. I mean, users are actually quite often wrong about what the right solution is. And it requires a deep understanding of the technical system and what's possible, combined with what the problem is you're trying to solve. Not just how the user expressed it, but what the true underlying problem is to actually get to the right place.
Yeah, that's the old like stories of Steve Jobs, like rolling in there, like, yeah, the user is a useful signal, but it's not a perfect signal. And sometimes you have to remove the floppy disk drive or whatever I forgot all the crazy stories of Steve Jobs, like making wild design decisions. Mm-hmm. But some of it is aesthetic, that some of it is about the love you put into the design, which is very much a Steve Jobs, Johnny Ive type thing. But when you have a human being using their brain to interact with it, it also is deeply about function. It's not just aesthetic.
Yep.
And that you have to empathize with a human being before you while not always listening to them directly. Like you have to deeply empathize. It's fascinating. It's really, really fascinating. And at the same time, iterate, right? But not iterate in small ways. Sometimes a complete, like rebuilding the design. He said that, Nolan said in the early days, the UX sucked, but you improved quickly. Yeah. What was that journey like?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give one concrete example. So he really wanted to be able to read manga. This is something that it sounds like a simple thing, but it's actually a really big deal for him. And he couldn't do it with this mouse stick. It wasn't accessible. You can't scroll with the mouse stick on his iPad on the website that he wanted to be able to use to read the newest manga. And so
might be a good quick pause to say the mouth stick is the thing he's using, holding a stick in his mouth to scroll on a tablet.
Right. Yeah. It's basically, you can imagine it's a stylus that you hold between your teeth. Yeah. It's basically a very long stylus.
And it's exhausting. It hurts. And it's inefficient.
Yeah. And maybe it's also worth calling out, there are other alternative assistive technologies, but the particular situation Nolan's in, and this is not uncommon, and I think it's also not well understood by folks, is that, he's relatively spastic, so he'll have muscle spasms from time to time. And so any assistive technology that requires him to be positioned directly in front of a camera, for example, an eye tracker, or anything that requires him to put something in his mouth, just is a no-go, because he'll either be shifted out of frame when he has a spasm, or if he has something in his mouth, it'll stab him in the face, if he spasms too hard. So these kind of considerations are important when thinking about what advantages a PCI has in someone's life. If it fits ergonomically into your life in a way that you can use it independently when your caretaker's not there, wherever you want to, either in the bed or in the chair, depending on your comfort level and your desire to have pressure sores, all these factors matter a lot in how good the solution is in that user's life. So one of these very fun examples is scroll. So again, manga is something he wanted to be able to read. And there's many ways to do scroll with a BCI. You can imagine like different gestures, for example, the user could do that would move the page. But scroll is a very fascinating control surface because it's a huge thing on the screen in front of you. Mm-hmm. So any sort of jitter in the model output, any sort of error in the model output causes like an earthquake on the screen. Like you really don't want to have your manga page that you're trying to read be shifted up and down a few pixels just because your scroll decoder is not completely accurate. And so this was an example where we had to figure out how to formulate the problem in a way that the errors of the system, whenever they do occur, and we'll do our best to minimize them, but whenever those errors do occur, that it doesn't interrupt the qualia, again, of the experience that the user is having. It doesn't interrupt their flow of reading their book. And so what we ended up building is this really brilliant feature. This is a teammate named Ruse who worked on this really brilliant work called Quick Scroll. And Quick Scroll basically looks at the screen and it identifies where on the screen are scroll bars. And it does this by deeply integrating with macOS to understand where are the scroll bars actively present on the screen using the sort of accessibility tree that's available to macOS apps. And we identified where those scroll bars are, and we provided a BCI scroll bar. And the BCI scroll bar looks similar to a normal scroll bar, but it behaves very differently in that once you sort of move over to it, your cursor sort of morphs onto it. It sort of attaches or latches onto it. And then once you push up or down in the same way that you'd use a push to control, the normal cursor, it actually moves the screen for you. So it's basically like remapping the velocity to a scroll action. And the reason that feels so natural and intuitive is that when you move over to attach to it, it feels like magnetic. So you're like sort of stuck onto it. And then it's one continuous action. You don't have to like switch your imagined movement. You sort of snap onto it and then you're good to go. You just immediately can start pulling the page down or pushing it up. And even once you get that right, there's so many little nuances of how the scroll behavior works to make it natural and intuitive. So one example is momentum. Like when you scroll a page with your fingers on the screen, you actually have some like flow. Like it doesn't just stop right when you lift your finger up. The same is true with BCI scroll. So we had to spend some time to figure out what are the right nuances when you don't feel the screen under your fingertip anymore. What is the right sort of dynamic, or what's the right amount of page give, if you will, when you push it to make it flow the right amount for the user to have a natural experience reading their book. And there's a million, I could tell you, like, there's so many little minutiae of how exactly that scroll works that we spent probably like a month getting right to make that feel extremely natural and easy for the user to navigate.
Even the scroll on a smartphone with your finger feels extremely natural and pleasant. And it probably takes an extremely long time to get that right. And actually the same kind of visionary UX design that we're talking about. Don't always listen to the users, but also listen to them, and also have like visionary, big, like throw everything out, think from first principles, but also not. Yeah. By the way, it just makes me think that scroll bars on the desktop probably have stagnated and never taken that, like, because the snap, same as it's like snap to grid, snap to scroll bar action you're talking about is something that could potentially be extremely useful in the desktop setting.
Yeah.
Even just for users to just improve the experience. Because the current scroll bar experience on the desktop is horrible.
Yeah.
It's hard to find, hard to control. There's not a momentum. There's, and the intention should be clear. When I start moving towards the scroll bar, there should be a snapping to the scroll bar action. But of course, maybe I'm okay paying that cost, but there's hundreds of millions of people paying that cost nonstop. But anyway, but in this case, this is necessary because there's an extra cost paid by Nolan for the jitteriness. So you have to switch between the scrolling and the reading. There has to be a phase shift between the two. Like when you're scrolling, you're scrolling.
Right. So that is one drawback of the current approach. Maybe one other just sort of case study here. So again, UX is how it works, and we think about that holistically from like even the feature detection level of what we detect in the brain to how we design the decoder, what we choose to decode, to then how it works once it's being used by the user. So another good example in that sort of how it works once they're actually using the decoder, the output that's displayed on the screen is not just what the decoder says. It's also a function of, what's going on the screen. So we can understand, for example, that, when you're trying to close a tab, that very small, stupid little X that's extremely tiny, which is hard to get precisely hit if you're dealing with sort of a noisy output of the decoder, we can understand that is a small little X you might be trying to hit and actually make it a bigger target for you. Similar to how when you're typing on your phone, if you're used to like the iOS keyboard, for example, it actually adapts the target size of individual keys based on an underlying language model. So it'll actually understand if I'm typing, hey, I'm going to see L, it'll make the E key bigger because it knows Lex is the person I'm going to go see. And so that kind of, predictiveness can make the experience much more smooth, even without, improvements to the underlying decoder or feature detection part of the stack. So we do that with a feature called magnetic targets. We actually index the screen and we understand, okay, these are the places that are, very small targets that might be difficult to hit. Here's the kind of cursor dynamics around that location that might be indicative of the user trying to select it. Let's make it easier. Let's blow up the size of it in a way that makes it easier for the user to sort of snap onto that target. So all these little details, they matter a lot in helping the user be independent in their day-to-day living.
So how much of the work on the decoder is generalizable to P2, P3, P4, P5, PN? How do you improve the decoder in a way that's generalizable?
Yeah, great question. So the underlying signal we're trying to decode is going to look very different in P2 than in P1. For example, channel number 345 is going to mean something different in user 1 than it will in user 2, just because that electrode that corresponds with channel 345 is going to be next to a different neuron in user 1 versus user 2. But the approaches, the methods, the user experience of how do you get the right sort of behavioral pattern from the user to associate with that neural signal, we hope that will translate over multiple generations of users. And beyond that, it's very, very possible, in fact, quite likely that we've overfit to sort of Nolan's user experience desires and preferences. And so what I hope to see is that, when we get a second, third, fourth participant, that we find sort of what the right wide minimas are that cover all the cases, that make it more intuitive for everyone. And hopefully there's a cross-pollination of things where, oh, we didn't think about that with this user because, they can speak. But with this user who just can fundamentally not speak at all, this user experience is not optimal. And that will actually, those improvements that we make there should hopefully translate then to even people who can speak but don't feel comfortable doing so because we're in a public setting like their doctor's office.
So the actual mechanism of open loop labeling and then closed loop labeling will be the same and hopefully can generalize across the different users. Correct. As they're doing the calibration step. And the calibration step is pretty cool. I mean, that in itself, the interesting thing about WebGrid, which is like closed loop, it's like fun. I love it when there's like, there used to be kind of an idea of human computation, which is using actions a human would want to do anyway to get a lot of signal from.
Yeah.
And like WebGrid is that, like a nice video game that also serves as great calibration.
It's so funny. I've heard this reaction so many times. Before sort of the first user was implanted, we had an internal perception that the first user would not find this fun.
Yeah.
And so we thought really quite a bit actually about like, should we build other games that like are, more interesting for the user so we can get this kind of data and help facilitate research that's, for long durations and stuff like this. It turns out that like people love this game.
Yeah.
I always loved it, but I didn't know that was a shared perception.
Yeah. And just in case it's not clear, WebGrid there's a grid of, let's say 35 by 35 cells, and one of them lights up blue, and you have to move your mouse over that and click on it. And if you miss it, and it's red, and
I played this game for so many hours, so many hours.
And what's your record? You said
I think I have the highest at Neuralink right now. My record's 17 BPS.
17 BPS,
which is about, if you imagine that 35 by 35 grid, you're hitting about 100 trials per minute. So 100 correct selections in that 1 minute window. So you're averaging about between 500 600 milliseconds per selection. So
one of the reasons that I think I struggle with that game is I'm such a keyboard person. So everything is done via keyboard. If I can avoid touching the mouse, it's great. So how can you explain your high performance?
I have like a whole ritual I go through when I play WebGrid. So there's actually like a diet plan associated with this. Like it's a whole thing. So
great.
The first thing
I have to fast for 5 days. I have to go up to the mountains.
Actually, the fasting thing is important. So this is like,
focuses the mind. Yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
So what I do is I don't eat for a little bit beforehand. And then I'll actually eat like a ton of peanut butter right before I play. And I get like
this is a real thing.
This is a real thing, yeah. And then it has to be really late at night. This is again a night owl thing I think we share, but it has to be like midnight, 2 a.m. kind of time window. And I have a very specific like physical position I'll sit in, which is I was homeschooled growing up, and so I did most of my work like on the floor, just like in my bedroom or whatever. And so I have a very specific situation
on the floor
that I sit and play. And then you have to make sure like there's not a lot of weight on your elbow when you're playing, so that you can move quickly. And then I turn the gain of the cursor, so the speed of the cursor way up. So it's like small motions that actually move the cursor.
Are you moving with your wrist, or you're never?
I move with my fingers. So my wrist is almost completely still. I'm just moving my fingers. Yeah.
Those, just on a small tangent.
Yeah.
Which I've been meaning to go down this rabbit hole of people that set the world record in Tetris. Those folks, they're playing. There's a way to. Did you see this?
I've seen like the three, like all the fingers are moving.
Yeah, you could find a way to do it where like it's using a loophole, like a bug that you can do some incredibly fast stuff. So it's along that line, but not quite. But you do realize there'll be like a few programmers right now listening to this who will fast and eat peanut butter.
Yeah, please break my record. I mean, the reason I did this literally was just because I wanted the bar to be high for the team. Like I wanted the number that we aim for should not be like the median performance. It should be like, it should be able to beat all of us at least. Like that should be the minimum bar.
What do you think is possible? Like 20?
Yeah, I don't know what the limits. I mean, the limits you can calculate just in terms of like screen refresh rate and like cursor immediately jumping to the next target. But I'm sure there's limits before that with just sort of reaction time and visual perception and things like this. I'd guess it's in the below 40, but above 20, somewhere in there. It's probably the right number to be thinking about. It also matters like how difficult the task is. You can imagine like some people might be able to do like 10,000 targets on the screen, and maybe they can do better that way. So there's some like task optimizations you could do to try to boost your performance as well.
What do you think it takes for Nolan to be able to do above 8.5 to keep increasing that number? You said like every increase in the number might require different improvements in the system.
Yeah, I think the nature of this work is, the first answer that's important to say is I don't know. This is edge of the research. So again, nobody's gotten to that number before. So what's next is going to be a heuristic, a guess from my part. What we've seen historically is that different parts of the stack become bottlenecks at different time points. So when I first joined Neuralink like 3 years ago or so, one of the major problems was just the latency of the Bluetooth connection. It was just like the radio on the device wasn't super good. It was an earlier version of the implant. And it just like, no matter how good your decoder was, if your thing is updating every 30 milliseconds or 50 milliseconds, it's just going to be choppy. And no matter how good you are, that's going to be frustrating and lead to challenges. So, at that point, it was very clear that the main challenge is just get the data off the device in a very reliable way such that you can enable the next challenge to be tackled. And then at some point it was, actually the modeling challenge of how do you just build a good mapping, like the supervised learning problem of you have a bunch of data and you have a label you're trying to predict. Just what is the right like neural decoder architecture and hyperparameters to optimize that? That was a problem for a bit. And once you solved that, it became a different bottleneck. I think the next bottleneck after that was actually just sort of software stability and reliability. If you have widely varying sort of inference latency in your system, or your app just lags out every once in a while, it decreases your ability to maintain and get in a state of flow, and it basically just disrupts your control experience. And so there's a variety of different software bugs and improvements we made that basically increased the performance of the system, made it much more reliable, much more stable, and led to a state where we could reliably collect data to build better models with. So that was a bottleneck for a while. It's just sort of like the software stack itself. If I were to guess right now, there's sort of two major directions you could think about for improving BPS further. The first major direction is labeling. So labeling is, again, this fundamental challenge of given a window of time where the user is expressing some behavioral intent, what are they really trying to do at the granularity of every millisecond? And that, again, is a task design problem. It's a UX problem. It's a machine learning problem. It's a software problem. It sort of touches all those different domains. The second thing you can think about to improve BPS further is either completely changing the thing you're decoding or just extending the number of things that you're decoding. So this is sort of in the direction of functionality. Basically, you can imagine giving more clicks. For example, a left click, a right click, a middle click, different actions like click and drag, for example, and that can improve the effective bitrate of your communication prosthesis. If you're trying to allow the user to express themselves through any given communication channel, you can measure that with bits per second. But what actually matters at the end of the day is how effective are they at navigating their computer. And so from the perspective of the downstream tasks that you care about, functionality and extending functionality is something we're very interested in, because not only can it improve the sort of number of BPS, but it can also improve the downstream sort of independence that the user has and the skill and efficiency with which they can operate their computer.
Would the number of threads increasing also potentially help?
Yes. Short answer is yes. It's a bit nuanced how that curve or how that manifests in the numbers. So what you'll see is that if you sort of plot a curve of number of channels that you're using for decode versus either the offline metric of how good you are at decoding or the online metric of sort of in practice how good is the user at using this device, you see roughly a log curve. So as you move further out in number of channels, you get a corresponding sort of logarithmic improvement in control quality and offline validation metrics. The important nuance here is that each channel corresponds with a specific, represented intention in the brain. So, for example, if you have a channel 254, it might correspond with moving to the right. Channel 256 might mean move to the left. If you want to expand the number of functions you want to control, you really want to have a broader set of channels that covers a broader set of imagined movements. You can think of it like kind of like Mr. Potato Man, actually. Like if you had a bunch of different imagined movements you could do, how would you map those imagined movements to input to a computer? You could imagine, handwriting to output characters on the screen. You could imagine just typing with your fingers and have that output text on the screen. You could imagine different finger modulations for different clicks. You can imagine wiggling your big nose for opening some menu, or wiggling your big toe to have like Command Tab occur or something like this. So it's really the amount of different actions you can take in the world depends on how many channels you have and the information content that they carry.
Right. So that's more about the number of actions. So actually, as you increase the number of threads, that's more about increasing the number of actions you're able to perform.
One other nuance there that is worth mentioning. So again, our goal is really to enable a user with paralysis to control the computer as fast as I can. So that's BPS. With all the same functionality I have, which is what we just talked about, but then also as reliably as I can.
Yeah.
And that last point is very related to channel count discussion. So as you scale out number of channels, the relative importance of any particular feature of your model input to the output control of the user diminishes, which means that if the sort of neural non-stationarity effect is per channel, or if the noise is independent, such that more channels means on average less output effect, then your reliability of your system will improve. So one sort of core thesis that at least I have is that scaling channel count should improve the reliability of the system without any work on the decoder itself.
Can you linger on the reliability here? So first of all, when you say non-stationarity of the signal, which aspect are you referring to?
Yeah, so maybe let's talk briefly what the actual underlying signal looks like. So again, I spoke very briefly at the beginning about how when you imagine moving to the right or imagine moving to the left, neurons might fire more or less. And the frequency content of that signal, at least in the motor cortex, is very correlated with the output intention, the behavioral task that the user is doing. You could imagine, actually, this is not obvious, that rate coding, which is the name of that phenomenon, is like the only way the brain can represent information. You can imagine many different ways in which the brain could encode intention. And there's actually evidence, like in bats, for example, that there's temporal codes, so timing codes of like exactly when particular neurons fire is the mechanism of information representation. But at least in the motor cortex, there's substantial evidence that it's rate coding, or at least one like first order effect is that it's rate coding. So then if the brain is representing information by changing the sort of frequency of a neuron firing, what really matters is sort of the delta between sort of the baseline state of the neuron and what it looks like when it's modulated. And what we've observed, and what has also been observed in academic work, is that baseline rate, sort of if you're to tar the scale, if you imagine that analogy for like measuring, flour or something when you're baking, that baseline state of how much the pot weighs is actually different day to day. And so if what you're trying to measure is how much rice is in the pot, you're going to get a different measurement different days because you're measuring with different pots. So that baseline rate shifting is really the thing that, at least from a first order description of the problem, is what's causing this downstream bias. There can be other effects, nonlinear effects on top of that, but at least at a very first order description of the problem, that's what we observe day to day, is that the baseline firing rate of any particular neuron or observed on a particular channel is changing. So
can you just adjust to the baseline to make it relative to the baseline nonstop?
Yeah, this is a great question. So with monkeys, we have found various ways to do this. One example way to do this is you ask them to do some behavioral task, like play the game with a joystick. You measure what's going on in the brain. You compute some mean of what's going on across all the input features, and you subtract that in the input when you're doing your BCI session. Works super well. For whatever reason, that doesn't work super well with Noland. I actually don't know the full reason why, but I can imagine several explanations. One such explanation could be that the context effect difference between some open loop task and some closed loop task is much more significant with Noland than it is with a monkey. Maybe in this open loop task, he's watching the Lex Fridman podcast while he's doing the task, or he's whistling and listening to music and talking with his friend and asking his mom what's for dinner while he's doing this task. And so the exact sort of difference in context between those two states may be much larger and thus lead to a bigger sort of generalization gap between the features that you're normalizing at sort of open loop time and what you're trying to use at closed loop time.
That's interesting. Just on that point, it's kind of incredible to watch Nolan be able to do to multitask, to do multiple tasks at the same time, to be able to move the mouse cursor effectively while talking and while being nervous because he's talking in front
kicking
of
my ass in chess too,
kicking your ass and not worry and talk trash while doing it.
Yes.
So all at the same time. And yes, if you're trying to normalize to the baseline, that might throw everything off. Boy, is that interesting.
Maybe one comment on that too. For folks that aren't familiar with assistive technology, I think there's a common belief that, well, why can't you just use an eye tracker or something like this for helping somebody move a mouse on the screen? And it's really a fair question, and one that I actually was not confident before sort of Noland that this was going to be a profoundly transformative technology for people like him. And I'm very confident now that it will be, but the reasons are subtle. It really has to do with ergonomically how it fits into their life. Mm-hmm. Even if you can just offer the same level of control as what they would have with an eye tracker or with a mouse stick, but you don't need to have that thing in your face. You don't need to be positioned a certain way. You don't need your caretaker to be around to set it up for you. You can activate it when you want, how you want, wherever you want. That level of independence is so game-changing for people. It means that they can text a friend at night privately without their mom needing to be in the loop. Mm-hmm. It means that they can open up, and browse the internet at 2 a.m. when nobody's around to set their iPad up for them. This is a profoundly game-changing thing for folks in that situation. And this is even before we start talking about folks that may not be able to communicate at all or ask for help when they want to. This can be potentially the only link that they have to the outside world. And that one doesn't, I think, need explanation of why that's so impactful.
You mentioned neural decoder. How much machine learning is in the decoder? How much magic? How much science? How much art? How difficult is it to come up with a decoder that figures out what these sequence of spikes mean?
Yeah, good question. There's a couple different ways to answer this. So maybe I'll zoom out briefly first, and then I'll go down one of the rabbit holes. So the zoomed out view is that building the decoder is really the process of building the data set plus compiling it into the weights. And each of those steps is important. The direction, I think, of further improvement is primarily going to be in the data set side of how do you construct the optimal labels for the model. But there's an entirely separate challenge of then how do you compile it into the best model. And so I'll go briefly down the second rabbit hole. One of the main challenges with designing the optimal model for BCI is that offline metrics don't necessarily correspond to online metrics. Mm-hmm. It's fundamentally a control problem. The user is trying to control something on the screen, and the exact sort of user experience of how you output the intention impacts their ability to control. So, for example, if you just look at validation loss as predicted by your model, there can be multiple ways to achieve the same validation loss. Not all of them are equally controllable by the end user. And so it might be as simple as saying, you could just add auxiliary loss terms that help you capture the thing that actually matters. But this is a very complex, nuanced process. So how you turn the labels into the model is more of a nuanced process than just a standard supervised learning problem. One very fascinating anecdote here, we've tried many different sort of neural network architectures that translate brain data to velocity outputs, for example. And one example that's stuck in my brain from a couple years ago now is at one point we were using just fully connected networks to decode the brain activity. We tried A/B test where we were measuring the relative performance in online control sessions of sort of 1D convolution over the input signal. So if you imagine per channel, you have a sliding window that's producing some convolve feature for each of those input sequences for every single channel simultaneously. You can actually get better validation metrics, meaning you're fitting the data better and it's generalizing better in offline data if you use this convolutional architecture. You're reducing parameters. It's sort of a standard procedure when you're dealing with time series data. Now, it turns out that when using that model online, the controllability was worse, was far worse, even though the offline metrics were better. And there can be many ways to interpret that, but what that taught me at least was that, hey, it's at least the case right now that if you were to just throw a bunch of compute at this problem, and you were trying to sort of hyperparameter optimize or, let some GPT model hard code or come up with or invent many different solutions, if you were just optimizing for loss, it would not be sufficient, which means that there's still some inherent modeling gap here. There's still some artistry left to be uncovered here of how to get your model to scale with more compute. And that may be fundamentally a labeling problem, but there may be other components to this as well.
Is it data constraint at this time? Which is what it sounds like. How do you get a lot of good labels?
Yeah, I think it's data quality constrained, not necessarily data quantity constrained.
But even just the quantity, I mean, because it has to be trained on the interactions. I guess there's not that many interactions.
Yeah, so it depends what version of this you're talking about. So if you're talking about, let's say the simplest example of just 2D velocity, then I think, data quality is the main thing. If you're talking about how to build a sort of multifunction output that lets you do all the inputs to the computer that you and I can do, then it's actually a much more sophisticated, nuanced modeling challenge, because now you need to think about not just when the user is left-clicking, but when you're building the left-click model, you also need to be thinking about how to make sure it doesn't fire when they're trying to right-click or when they're trying to move the mouse. So one example of an interesting bug from sort of week one of BCI with Nolan was when he moved the mouse, the click signal sort of dropped off a cliff, and when he stopped, the click signal went up. So again, there's a contamination between the the two inputs. Another good example was at one point he was trying to do sort of a left click and drag, and the minute he started moving, the left click signal dropped off a cliff. So again, because there's some contamination between the two signals, you need to come up with some way to either in the data set or in the model build robustness against this kind of you think of it like overfitting, but really it's just that the model has not seen this kind of variability before. So you need to find some way to help the model with that.
This is super cool because it feels like all of this is very solvable, but it's hard.
Yes, it is fundamentally an engineering challenge. This is important to emphasize, and it's also important to emphasize that it may not need fundamentally new techniques, which means that people who work on, let's say, unsupervised speech classification using CTC loss, for example, with internal to Siri, they could potentially have very applicable skills to this.
So what things are you excited about in the future development of the software stack on the Neuralink? So everything we've been talking about, the decoding, the UX.
I think there's some I'm excited about, like something I'm excited about from the technology side, and some I'm excited about for understanding how this technology is going to be best situated for entering the world. So I'll work backwards. On the technology entering the world side of things, I'm really excited to understand how this device works for folks that cannot speak at all, that have no ability to sort of bootstrap themselves into useful control by voice command, for example, and are extremely limited in their current capabilities. I think that will be an incredibly useful signal for us to understand, really what is an existential threat for all startups, which is product market fit. Does this device have the capacity and potential to transform people's lives in the current state? And if not, what are the gaps? And if there are gaps, how do we solve them most efficiently? So that's what I'm very excited about for the next sort of year or so of clinical trial operations. On the technology side, I'm quite excited about basically everything we're doing. I think it's going to be awesome. The most prominent one I would say is scaling channel count. So right now we have a 1,000 channel device. The next version will have between 3,000 and 6,000 channels, and I would expect that curve to continue in the future. And it's unclear what set of problems will just disappear completely at that scale, and what set of problems will remain and require further focus. And so I'm excited about the clarity of gradient that gives us in terms of the user experience that we choose to focus our time and resources on, and also in terms of even things as simple as non-stationarity. Like, does that problem just completely go away at that scale? Or do we need to come up with new creative UXs still, even at that point? And also, when we get to that time point, when we start expanding out dramatically the set of functions that you can output from one brain, how to deal with all the nuances of both the user experience of not being able to feel the different keys under your fingertips, but still needing to be able to modulate all of them in synchrony to achieve the thing you want. And again, you don't have that proprioceptive feedback loop, so how can you make that intuitive for a user to control a high-dimensional control surface without feeling the thing physically? I think that's going to be a super interesting problem. I'm also quite excited to understand, do these scaling laws continue? Like, as you scale channel count, how much further out do you go before that saturation point is truly hit? And it's not obvious today. I think we only know what's in the sort of interpolation space. We only know what's between 0 and 1024, but we don't know what's beyond that. And then there's a whole sort of like range of interesting sort of neuroscience and brain questions, which is when you stick more stuff in the brain in more places, you get to learn much more quickly about what those brain regions represent. And so I'm excited about that fundamental neuroscience learning, which is also important for figuring out how to most efficiently insert electrodes in the future. So yeah, I think all those dimensions I'm really, really excited about. And that doesn't even get close to touching the sort of software stack that we work on every single day and what we're working on right now.
Yeah, it seems virtually impossible to me that 1,000 electrodes is where it saturates. It feels like this would be one of those silly notions in the future where obviously you should have millions of electrodes, and this is where like the true breakthroughs happen.
Yep.
You tweeted,
Oh,
some thoughts are most precisely described in poetry. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because the information bottleneck of language is pretty steep, and yet you're able to reconstruct in the other person's brain more effectively without being literal. Like if you can express a sentiment such that in their brain they can reconstruct the actual true underlying meaning and beauty of the thing that you're trying to get across, the generator function in their brain is more powerful than what language can express. And so the mechanism of poetry is really just to feed or seed that generator function.
So being literal sometimes is a suboptimal compression for the thing you're trying to convey.
And it's actually in the process of the user going through that generation that they understand what you mean. Like that's the beautiful part. It's also like when you look at a beautiful painting, like it's not the pixels of the painting that are beautiful. It's the thought process that occurs when you see that, the experience of that actually is the thing that matters.
Yeah, it's resonating with some deep
Yeah.
thing within you that the artist also experienced and was able to convey that through the
Right.
pixels.
Right.
And that's actually going to be relevant for full-on telepathy. You know, it's like if you just read the poetry literally, that doesn't say much of anything interesting. It requires a human to interpret it. So it's the combination of the human mind and all the experiences the human being has within the context of the collective intelligence of the human species that makes that poem make sense. And they load that in. And so in that same way, the signal that carries from human to human meaning may seem trivial, but may actually carry a lot of power because of the complexity of the human mind on the receiving end. Yeah, that's interesting. Poetry still doesn't. Who was it? I think Yoshibaku Francois Cholet said something about all the people that think we've achieved AGI explain why humans like music.
Oh yeah.
And until the AGI likes music, you haven't achieved AGI or something like that.
Do you not think that's like some next token entropy surprise kind of thing going on there?
I don't know.
I don't know either. I listen to a lot of classical music and also read a lot of poetry. And yeah, I do wonder if like there is some element of the next token surprise factor going on there.
Yeah, maybe.
Because I mean, like a lot of the tricks in both poetry and music are like basically you have some repeated structure and then you do like a twist.
Yeah.
Like it's like, okay, verse or like clause 1, 2, 3 is one thing. And then clause 4 is like, okay, now we're on to the next theme.
Yeah.
And they kind of play with exactly when the surprise happens and the expectation of the user. And that's even true like through history as musicians evolve music. They take like some known structure that people are familiar with and they just tweak it a little bit. Like they tweak it and add a surprising element. This is especially true in classical music heritage. But that's what I'm wondering. Like, is it all just entropy? Like
so breaking structure or breaking symmetry is something that humans seem to like. Maybe as simple as that.
Yeah, and I mean, great artists copy, and they also, knowing which rules to break is the important part. And fundamentally, it must be about the listener of the piece. Like, which rule is the right one to break? It's about the user or the audience member perceiving that as interesting.
What do you think is the meaning of human existence?
There's a TV show I really like called The West Wing. And in The West Wing, there's a character, he's the president of the United States, who's having a discussion about the Bible with one of their colleagues. And the colleague says something about, the Bible says X, Y, and Z. And the president says, yeah, but it also says A, B, C. And person says, do you believe the Bible to be literally true? And the president says, yes, but I also think that neither of us are smart enough to understand it. I think to like the analogy here for the meaning of life is that largely we don't know the right question to ask. And so I think I'm very aligned with sort of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy version of this question, which is basically if we can ask the right questions, it's much more likely we find the meaning of human existence. And so in the short term, as a heuristic in the sort of search policy space, we should try to increase the diversity of people asking such questions, or generally of consciousness and conscious beings asking such questions. So again, I think I'll take the I don't know card here, but say I do think there are meaningful things we can do that improve the likelihood of answering that question.
It's interesting how much value you assign to the task of asking the right questions. That's the main thing, is not the answers, is the questions.
This point, by the way, is driven home in a very painful way when you try to communicate with someone who cannot speak. Because a lot of the time, the last thing to go is they have the ability to somehow, wiggle a lip or move something that allows them to say yes or no. And in that situation, it's very obvious that what matters is, are you asking them the right question to be able to say yes or no to?
Wow, that's powerful. Well, Bliss, thank you for everything you do. And thank you for being you. And thank you for talking today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Bliss Chapman. And now, dear friends, here's Nolan Arbaugh, the first human being to have a Neuralink device implanted in his brain. You had a diving accident in 2016 that left you paralyzed with no feeling from the shoulders down. How did that accident change your life?
It was sort of a freak thing that happened. Imagine you're running into the ocean. Although this is a lake, but you're running into the ocean and you get to about waist high, and then you kind of like dive in, take the rest of the plunge under the wave or something. That's what I did. And then I just never came back up. Not sure what happened. I did it running into the water with a couple of guys. And so my idea of what happened is really just that I took like a stray fist, elbow, knee, foot, something to the side of my head. The left side of my head was sore for about a month afterwards. So must have taken a pretty big knock. And then they both came up and I didn't. And so I was face down in the water for a while. I was conscious. Um, and then eventually just, realized I couldn't hold my breath any longer. And I keep saying, took a big drink. People, I don't know if they like that I say that. It seems like I'm making light of it all, but this is kind of how I am. And I don't know, like I'm a very relaxed, sort of stress-free person. I rolled with the punches for a lot of this. I kind of took it in stride. It's like, all right, well, what can I do next? How can I improve my life even a little bit? On a day-to-day basis at first, just trying to find some way to heal as much of my body as possible. To try to get healed, to try to get off a ventilator, learn as much as I could so I could somehow survive once I left the hospital. And then thank God I had like my family around me. If I didn't have my parents, my siblings, then I would have never made it this far. They've done so much for me, more than like I can ever thank them for, honestly. And a lot of people don't have that. A lot of people in my situation, their families either aren't capable of providing for them or honestly just don't want to. And so they get placed somewhere and, in some sort of home. So thankfully, I had my family. I have a great group of friends, a great group of buddies from college who have all rallied around me, and we're all still incredibly close. People always say, if you're lucky, you'll end up with one or two friends from high school that you keep throughout your life. I have about 10 or 12 from high school that have all stuck around, and we still get together, all of us, twice a year. We call it the spring series and the fall series. This last one we all did, we dressed up like X-Men. So I did a
Nice.
Professor Xavier, and it was freaking awesome. It was so good. So yeah, I have such a great support system around me. And so, being a quadriplegic isn't that bad. I get waited on all the time. People bring me food and drinks, and I get to sit around and watch as much TV and movies and anime as I want. I get to read as much as I want. I mean, it's great.
It's beautiful to see that you see the silver lining in all of this. But just going back, do you remember the moment when you first realized you're paralyzed from
Yeah.
the neck down?
Yep. I was face down in the water. Um, right when whatever, something hit my head. I tried to get up and I realized I couldn't move and it just sort of clicked. I'm like, all right, I'm paralyzed, can't move. What do I do? If I can't get up, I can't flip over, can't do anything, then I'm going to drown eventually. And I knew I couldn't hold my breath forever. So I just held my breath and thought about it for maybe 10, 15 seconds. I've heard from other people that, like onlookers, I guess, the two girls that pulled me out of the water were two of my best friends. They are lifeguards. Um, and one of them said that it looked like my body was sort of shaking in the water, like I was trying to flip over and stuff. Um, but I knew immediately. And I just I realized that that's like what my situation was from here on out. Maybe if I got to the hospital, they'd be able to do something. When I was in the hospital, like right before surgery, I was trying to calm one of my friends down. I had like brought her with me from college to camp, and she was just bawling over me. And I was like, "Hey, it's gonna be fine. Like, don't worry." I was cracking some jokes to try to lighten the mood. The nurse had called my mom, and I was like, "Don't tell my mom. She's just gonna be stressed out. Call her after I'm out of surgery because at least she'll have some answers then, like whether I live or not, really." And I didn't want her to be stressed through the whole thing, but I knew. And then when I first woke up after surgery, I was super drugged up. They had me on fentanyl like 3 ways, which was awesome. I don't recommend it, but I saw some crazy stuff on that fentanyl, and it was still the best I've ever felt on drugs. Um, Medication, sorry, on medication. Um, and I remember the first time I saw my mom in the hospital, I was just bawling. I had like ventilator in, like I couldn't talk or anything. And I just started crying because it was more like seeing her. Not that, I mean, the whole situation obviously was pretty rough, but it was just like seeing her face for the first time was pretty hard. But yeah, I never had like a moment of, man, I'm paralyzed. This sucks. I don't want to like be around anymore. It was always just, I hate that I have to do this, but like sitting here and wallowing isn't going to help.
So immediate acceptance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Has there been low points along the way?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are days when I don't really feel like doing anything. Not so much anymore. Like not for the last couple years. I don't really feel that way. I've um more so just wanted to try to do anything possible to make my life better at this point. But at the beginning, there were some ups and downs. There were some really hard things to adjust to. Um, First off, just like the first couple months, the amount of pain I was in was really, really hard. I mean, I remember screaming at the top of my lungs in the hospital because I thought my legs were on fire. And obviously, I can't feel anything, but it's all nerve pain. And so that was a really hard night. I asked them to give me as much pain meds as possible. They're like, you've had as much as you can have, so just kind of deal with it. Go to a happy place, sort of thing. So that was a pretty low point. And then every now and again, it's hard, like realizing things that I wanted to do in my life that I won't be able to do anymore. Um, I always wanted to be a husband and father, and I just don't think that I could do it now as a quadriplegic. Maybe it's possible, but I'm not sure I would ever put someone I love through that, like having to take care of me and stuff. Um, Not being able to, go out and play sports. I was a huge athlete growing up, so that was pretty hard. Just little things too, when I realized I can't do them anymore. Like there's something really special about being able to hold a book and smell a book, like the feel, the texture, the smell, like as you turn the pages, like I just love it. I can't do it anymore. And it's little things like that. The 2 year mark was pretty rough. 2 years is when they say you will um, get back basically as much as you're ever going to get back as far as movement and sensation goes. And so for the first 2 years, that was the only thing on my mind was like try as much as I can to move my fingers, my hands, my feet, everything possible to try to get sensation and movement back. And then when the 2 year mark hit, so June 30th, 2018, I was I was really sad that that's kind of where I was. And then just randomly here and there, but I was never like depressed for long periods of time. Just it never seemed worthwhile to me.
What gave you strength?
My faith in God was a big one. My understanding that it was all for a purpose, and even if that purpose wasn't anything involving Neuralink, even if that purpose was, you know, There's a story in the Bible about Job, and I think it's a really, really popular story about how Job, has all of these terrible things happen to him, and he praises God throughout the whole situation. I thought, and I think a lot of people think for most of their lives, that they are Job, that they're the ones going through something terrible, and they just need to, praise God through the whole thing, and everything will work out. At some point after my accident, I realized that I might not be Job, that I might be, one of his children that gets killed or kidnapped or taken from him. And so it's about terrible things that happen to those around you who you love. So maybe, in this case, my mom would be Job, and she has to get through something extraordinarily hard. And I just need to try and make it as best as possible for her, because she's the one that's really going through this massive trial. And that gave me a lot of strength. And obviously my family and my friends, they give me all the strength that I need on a day-to-day basis. So it makes things a lot easier having that great support system around me.
From everything I've seen of you online, your streams, and the way you are today, I really admire, let's say, your unwavering positive outlook on life. Has that always been this way?
Yeah, yeah. I've just always thought I could do anything I ever
Yeah.
wanted to do. There was never anything too big. Like whatever I set my mind to, I felt like I could do it. I didn't want to do a lot. I wanted to like travel around and be sort of like a gypsy and like go work odd jobs. I had this dream of traveling around Europe and being like, I don't know, a shepherd in like Wales or Ireland, and then going and being a fisherman in Italy, doing all of these things for like a year. Like it's such like cliche things, but I just thought it would be so much fun to go and travel and do different things. And so I've always just seen the best in people around me too. And I've always tried to be good to people. And growing up with my mom too, she's like the most positive, energetic person in the world. And we're all just people. Like, I just get along great with people. I really enjoy meeting new people. And so, I just wanted to do everything. This is just kind of just how I've been.
It's just great to see that cynicism didn't take over, given everything you've been through.
Yeah.
That's was that like a deliberate choice you made that you're not going to let this keep you down?
Yeah, a bit. Also, like it's just kind of how I am. I just,
Yeah.
like I said, I roll with the punches with everything. I always used to tell people, like, I don't stress about things much. And whenever I'd see people getting stressed, I would just say, like, it's not hard. Just don't stress about it. And like, that's all you need to do. And they're like, that's not how that works. I'm like, it works for me. Like, just don't stress and everything will be fine. Like, everything will work out. Obviously, not everything always goes well, and it's not like it all works out for the best all the time, but I just don't think stress has had any place in my life since I was a kid.
What was the experience like of you being selected to be the first human being to have a Neuralink device implanted in your brain? Were you scared? Excited?
No, it was cool. um like I was I was never afraid of it. I had to think through a lot. should i should I do this? Like, be the first person? I could wait until number 2 or 3 and get a better version of the Neuralink. Like, the first one might not work. Maybe it's actually gonna kind of suck. It's gonna be the worst version ever in a person. So why would I do the first one? Like, I've already kind of been selected. I could just tell them, like, okay, find someone else, and then I'll do number 2 or 3. Like, I'm sure they would let me. They're looking for a few people anyways. But ultimately, I was like, I don't know, there's something about being the first one to do something. It's pretty cool. I always thought that if I had the chance, that I would like to do something for the first time. This seemed like a pretty good opportunity. And I was never scared. I think my like faith had a huge part in that. I always felt like God was preparing me for something. I almost wish it wasn't this because I had many conversations with God about not wanting to do any of this as a quadriplegic. I told him, I'll go out and talk to people. I'll go out and travel the world and talk to, stadiums, thousands of people, give my testimony. I'll do all of it, but like heal me first. Don't make me do all of this in a chair. That sucks. Um, and I guess he won that argument. I didn't really have much of a choice. I always felt like there was something going on. And to see how, I guess, easily I made it through the interview process and how quickly everything happened, how the stars sort of aligned with all of this, it it just told me, like as the surgery was getting closer, it just told me that it was all meant to happen. It was all meant to be. And so I shouldn't be afraid of anything that's to come. And so I wasn't. I kept telling myself, like, you say that now, but as soon as the surgery comes, you're probably going to be freaking out. Like, you're about to have brain surgery, and brain surgery is a big deal for a lot of people, but it's a even bigger deal for me. Like, it's all I have left. The amount of times I've been like, thank you, God, that you didn't take my brain and my personality and my ability to think, my like love of learning, like my character, everything. Like, thank you so much. Like, as long as you left me that, then I think I can get by. And I was about to let people go, like root around in there, like, hey, we're gonna go like put some stuff in your brain, like hopefully it works out. Um, and so it was something that gave me pause. But like I said, how smoothly everything went. I never expected for a second that anything would go wrong. Plus, the more people I met on the Barrows side and on the Neuralink side, they're just the most impressive people in the world. Like, I can't speak enough to how much I trust these people with my life and how impressed I am with all of them. And to see the excitement on their faces, to like walk into a room and roll into a room and see all of these people looking at me like we're so excited. Like, we've been working so hard on this and it's finally happening. It's super infectious. And it just makes me want to do it even more and to help them achieve their dreams. Like, I don't know, it's so rewarding, and I'm so happy for all of them, honestly.
What was the day of surgery like? What's when did you wake up? What did you feel minute
Yeah,
by minute?
yeah.
Were you freaking out?
No, no. I thought I was going to, but as surgery approached the night before, the morning of, I was just excited. Like, I was like, let's make this happen. I think I said that, something like that to Elon on the phone. Beforehand, we were like FaceTiming, and I was like, let's rock and roll. And he's like, let's do it. I don't know. I wasn't scared. So we woke up. I think we had to be at the hospital at like 5:30 a.m. I think surgery was at like 7 a.m. So we woke up pretty early. I'm not sure much of us slept that night. Um, um, got to the hospital 5:30, went through like all the pre-op stuff. Everyone was super nice. Elon was supposed to be there in the morning, but something went wrong with his plane, so we ended up FaceTiming. That was cool. Had one of the greatest one-liners of my life after that phone call. Hung up with him. There were like 20 people around me, and I was like, I just hope he wasn't too starstruck talking to me.
Nice.
And yeah, it
Well
was
done.
good.
Well done.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you write that ahead of time or it
No,
just
no,
came to
it just came to me. I was like, this seems
Nice.
right, Went into surgery. I asked if I could pray right beforehand, so I like prayed over the room. I asked God if he would like be with my mom in case anything happened to me, and just to like calm her nerves out there. Woke up, and played a bit of a prank on my mom. I don't know if you've heard about it.
Yeah, I read about it.
Yeah, she was not happy.
Can you take me through the prank? And
Yeah, this is
do you
something.
regret doing that now?
Nope,
Was it?
nope, not one bit. It was something. It was something I had talked about ahead of time with my buddy Bane. I was like, I would really like to play a prank on my mom. Very specifically my mom. She's very gullible. I think she had knee surgery once, even, and after she came out of knee surgery, um, she was super groggy. She's like, I can't feel my legs. And my dad looked at her. He was like, you don't have any legs. Like they had to amputate both your legs.
Oh, boy.
And we just do very mean things to her all the time.
Yes.
I'm so surprised that she still loves us. But right after surgery, I was really worried that I was going to be too like groggy, like not all there. I had had anesthesia once before, and it messed me up. Like I could not function for a while afterwards, and I like said a lot of things that I was really worried that I was gonna start, I don't know, like dropping some bombs, and I wouldn't even know, I wouldn't remember. So I was like, please God, don't let that happen, and please let me be there enough to do this to my mom. Um, and so she walked in after surgery. It was like the first time they had been able to see me after surgery, and she just looked at me. She said, "Hi, like, how are you? How are you doing? How do you feel?" And I looked at her, and just this very, I think the anesthesia helped, very like groggy, sort of confused look on my face. It's like, who are you? And she just started looking around the room, like at the surgeons, at the doctors, like, what did you do to my son? Like, you need to fix this right now. Tears started streaming. I saw how much she was freaking out. I was like, I can't let this go on. And so I was like, Mom, I'm fine. Like, it's all right. And still, she was not happy about it. She still says she's going to get me back someday, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know what that's going to look like.
It's a
But I think,
lifelong battle.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it was good.
In some sense, it was a demonstration that you still got.
That's all I
that
wanted it
sense
to
of
be.
humor.
That's all I wanted it to be. And I knew that doing something super mean to her like that would show
There's
her
actually a
that-
way
yeah.
to show that you're still there, that you love her.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a
Exactly.
dark way to do it, but I love it.
Yeah.
What was the first time you were able to feel that you can use the Neuralink device to affect the world around you?
Yeah, the first little taste I got of it was actually not too long after surgery. Some of the Neuralink team had brought in um, like a little iPad, a little tablet screen, and they had put up 8 different channels that were recording some of my neuron spikes. And they put it in front of me. They're like, "This is like real time, your brain firing." I was like, "That's super cool." Um, my first thought was, I mean, if they're firing now, let's see if I can affect them in some way. So I started trying to like wiggle my fingers, and I just started like scanning through the channels. And one of the things I was doing was like moving my index finger up and down. And I just saw this yellow spike on like top row, like third box over or something. I saw this yellow spike every time I did it. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And everyone around me was just like, what are you seeing? I was like, look at this one. Look at like this top row, third box over, this yellow spike. Like that's me right there, there. And everyone was freaking out. They started like clapping.
Mhm.
I was like, that's super unnecessary. Like
That's
this is what's
awesome, though.
supposed to happen, right? Like,
So you're imagining yourself moving each individual finger one at a time,
yeah.
and then seeing like that you can notice something. And then when you did
Just-
the index finger, you're like, oh,
Yeah,
Cool.
I was wiggling kind of all of my fingers to see if anything would happen. There was a lot of other things going on, but that big yellow spike was the one that stood out to me. Like I'm sure that if I would have stared at it long enough, I could have mapped out maybe 100 different things, but the big yellow spike was the one that I noticed.
maybe you can speak to what it's like to sort of wiggle your fingers, to like to imagine that the mental, the cognitive effort required to sort of wiggle your index finger, for example. How easy is that to do?
Pretty easy for me. It's something that at the very beginning after my accident, they told me to try and move my body as much as possible, even if you can't. Just keep trying because that's going to create new like neural pathways or pathways in my spinal cord to like reconnect these things, to hopefully regain some movement someday.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I know it's bizarre, but
So that's part of the recovery process, is
It
to
is.
keep trying to move your body,
yep.
and
Every
that's
day as much as you can.
And the nervous system does its thing. It
Yeah.
starts reconnecting.
It'll start reconnecting. For some people, some people it never works. Some people they'll do it. Like for me, I got some bicep control back, and that's about it. I can, if I try enough, I can wiggle some of my fingers, not like on command. It's more like if I try to move, say, my right pinky, and I just keep trying to move it, after a few seconds, it'll wiggle. So I know there's stuff there. Like I know, like, and that happens with, a few different of my fingers and stuff. Um, but yeah, that's what they tell you to do. One of the people at the time when I was in the hospital came in and told me, for one guy who had recovered most of his control, what he thought about every day was actually walking, like the act of walking, just over and over again. So I tried that for years. I tried just imagining walking, which is, it's hard. It's hard to imagine like all of the steps that go into, well, taking a step, like all of the things that have to move, like all of the activations that have to happen along your leg in order for one step to occur.
But you're not just imagining, you're like doing it, right?
I'm trying, yeah.
Right.
So it's like, it's imagining over again what I had to do to take a step, because it's not something any of us think about. You want to
Yeah.
walk and you take a step. You don't think about all of the different things that are going on in your body. So I had to recreate that in my head as much as I could, and then I practice it over and over and over.
So it's not like a third person perspective, it's a first person perspective. You're like, it's not like you're imagining yourself walking. You're like literally doing this everything, all the same stuff as if you're walking.
Yeah. Which was hard. It was hard at the beginning.
Like frustrating hard or like actually cognitively hard? Like which way?
It was both. There's a scene in one of the Kill Bill movies, actually, oddly enough, where she is like paralyzed. I don't know, from like a drug that was in her system, and then she like finds some way to get into the back of a truck or something, and she stares at her toe and she says, "Move, like move your big toe," and after a few seconds on screen, she does it, and she did that with every one of her like body parts until she can move again. I did that for years. Just stared at my body and said, "Move your index finger, move your big toe." Sometimes vocalizing it like out loud, sometimes just thinking it. I tried every different way to do this to try to get some movement back. And it's hard because it actually is like taxing, like physically taxing on my body, which is something I would have never expected, because it's not like I'm moving, but it feels like there's a buildup of, I don't know, the only way I can describe it is there are like signals that aren't getting through from my brain down, because there's that gap in my spinal cord. So brain down, and then from my hand back up to the brain. And so it feels like those signals get stuck in whatever body part that I'm trying to move, and they just build up and build up and build up until they burst. And then once they burst, I get like this really weird sensation of everything sort of like dissipating back out to level, and then I do it again. It's also just like a fatigue thing, like a muscle fatigue, but without actually moving your muscles. It's very, very bizarre. And then, if you try to stare at a body part or think about a body part and move for 2, 3, 4, sometimes 8 hours, it's very taxing on your mind. It takes a lot of focus. It was a lot easier at the beginning because I wasn't able to like control a TV in my room or anything. I wasn't able to control any of my environment. So for the first few years, a lot of what I was doing was staring at walls. And so obviously I did a lot of thinking, and I tried to move a lot, just over and over and over again.
So you never gave up sort of hope there.
No.
Just training hard, essentially.
Yep. And I still do it. I do it like subconsciously. And I think that that helped a lot with things with Neuralink, honestly.
Yeah.
It's something that I talked about the other day at the all hands that I did at Neuralink's Austin facility.
Welcome to Austin, by the way.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, man. I went to
Nice
school.
hat.
Hey, thanks, man. The the Gigafactory was super cool. I went to school at Texas A&M, so I've been around before.
So you should be saying, welcome to me.
Yeah.
Welcome to Texas, Lex.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get you.
But yeah, I was talking about how a lot of what they've had me do, especially at the beginning, well, I still do it now, is body mapping. So like there will be a visualization of a hand or an arm on the screen, and I have to do that motion, and that's how they sort of train the algorithm to like understand what I'm trying to do. And so it made things very seamless for me, I think.
That's really, really cool. So
Yeah.
it's amazing to know because I've learned a lot about the body mapping procedure.
Yeah.
With the interface and everything like that. It's cool to know that you've been essentially like training to be like world class at that task.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if other quadriplegics, like other paralyzed people, give up. I hope they don't. I hope they keep trying, because I've heard other paralyzed people say, like, don't ever stop. They tell you 2 years, but you just never know. You're the human body's capable of amazing things. So I've heard other people say, don't give up. Like I think one girl had spoken to me through some family members and said that she had been paralyzed, for 18 years, and she'd been trying to like wiggle her index finger for all that time, and she finally got it back like 18 years later. So like I know that it's possible, and I'll never give up doing it. I do it when I'm lying down like watching TV. I'll find myself doing it kind of just almost like on its own. It's just something I've gotten so used to doing that I don't know. I don't think I'll ever stop.
That's really awesome to hear, because I think it's one of those things that can really pay off in the long term. Because like it is training, you're not visibly seeing the results of that training at the moment, but like there's that like Olympic level nervous system getting ready for something.
Honestly was like something that I think Neuralink gave me that I can't thank them enough for. Like I can't show my appreciation for it enough, was being able to visually see that what I'm doing is actually having some effect.
Yeah.
It's a huge part of the reason why